problem. Many honourable senators have already cast doubt on the accuracy of these assertions.
All right, folks, it looks like the CPAC's reading is going on right now, so we're just going to listen to that and do our 420 in 20 minutes. We're going to see how this turns out. Stay tuned. Let's listen.
Use among Canadian teenagers aged 15 to 16. The most recent Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey, a national biennial survey conducted in partnership with Health Canada, found that cannabis use among Canadian teenagers in grades 7 to 12 has declined steadily, falling from 27% in 2008 to 17% in 2014. And a cross-national peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of the Public Library of Science, conducted to understand the effects of cannabis legalization on adolescents, found that cannabis liberalization in 38 different countries was associated with higher levels of more frequent cannabis use among teenagers. Nevertheless, the government has made clear that no matter what the facts and no matter the gaps in evidence and knowledge, it will stay the course. The task before us, therefore, must become to ensure that the framework outlined in Bill C-45 minimizes the harms associated with the legalization of cannabis, especially for children and teenagers. The health hazards associated with cannabis use have been well enumerated in this chamber. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, Canada's largest mental health and addiction hospital, has stated unequivocally that cannabis is not a benign substance and its health harms increase with intensity of use. Really? We know that while adults are susceptible to the harms of cannabis, teenagers developing brains are at greatest risk. The Canadian Pediatric Society cautions that marijuana use in youth is strongly linked to cannabis dependence and other substance abuse disorders.
Really?
The initiation and maintenance of tobacco smoking, an increased presence of mental illness, including depression, anxiety, and psychosis, impaired neurological development and cognitive decline, and diminished school performance and lifetime achievement.
Really?
Moreover,
that's bullshit.
We cannot forget that when we talk about cannabis use, we are talking
really
about smoking.
No, you're not.
The vast majority of cannabis
smoking, eating,
in
vaping
Canada is inhaled, with nearly 90% being smoked in a joint, a pipe, or a bong. Professor David Sweener, a noted public health expert at the University of Ottawa, makes this connection crystal clear, and I quote, "Smoking involves combustion. Combustion results in unwanted and harmful chemicals being inhaled into the lungs. Although the way people smoke tobacco and marijuana differs in ways such as the amount they smoke and how deeply they inhale, the fact remains that inhaling smoke is a particularly harmful practice." If the government refuses to acknowledge that legalization alone won't reduce the prevalence of cannabis use among adolescents, we must ask ourselves how the legislation before us today specifically addresses those associated harms. Honourable Senators, the fact
but you won't let us address those harms because there can't be any fucking studies done and release the information with ease. There's always bullshit involved.
Especially when it comes to our kids.
They did a study for pregnant mothers, and the healthiest babies in the world are in Jamaica to mothers smoking marijuana.
Reduced perceptions of the risk of cannabis smoking. Honourable Senators, when I think about the independent, non-partisan work that was undertaken in this chamber just last year on Bill S-5, I find it hard to believe that just a few months later, we find ourselves debating legislation that threatens to undo our progress. Simply put, this government's approach to cannabis and tobacco are fundamentally different, despite the fact that the health minister sat before us in this chamber and told us they were the same. Honourable Senators are free to draw their own conclusions as to why that's the case, but the facts remain. Tobacco
lunchboxes are the furthest thing from my mind right now.
With eventual elimination. Nearly all forms of marketing are banned. Tobacco packages include graphic warnings, and if the government doesn't backtrack on the commitments it made in S5, soon they will be sold in identical plain packages. It is heavily taxed to disincentivize its use. Smoking is banned in all indoor public places. And it's working. Canadians are budding out in record numbers, a true public health success story. In 1980, 1 in 3 Canadians smoked cigarettes. Today, that number is less than 1 in 5.
Nice.
Compare that with the government's plan for regulating marijuana, which contains far fewer restrictions than were even recommended by their own expert task force. While it's true that C-45 prohibits the promotion, packaging, and labeling to cannabis that may be appealing to young persons, colors and logos will be permitted, and the door to adult advertising is wide open. Cannabis will be sold at so-called competitive prices, with a gram being sold for much less than a pack of cigarettes. Several jurisdictions have already signaled interest in licensing indoor smoking lounges. Condominium and apartment dwellers are grappling with the prospect of their homes being infiltrated by the odor of secondhand cannabis smoke. As public health experts have pointed out, the government's approach to regulating cannabis promotion has far more in common with how we regulate alcohol, an approach that has failed to protect underage users, the exact same population we are trying to protect. With a patchwork system of provincial regulations, alcohol manufacturers have become adept at exploiting obvious loopholes. In some provinces, alcohol billboards appear outside of school property. Children and teenagers are regularly exposed to enticing commercials on television. And despite federal rules in place that are similar to those outlined in Bill C-45, alcohol ads appear regularly on Facebook and other social networks. We are kidding ourselves if we think the same thing won't happen with cannabis. It is simply not realistic to expect that other bodies will step in and regulate appropriately. Cannabis producers have already seized the opportunity to develop their own guidelines. Voluntary advertising and marketing codes have always proven themselves to be ripe for exploitation. If we truly believe that the intent of this legislation is, as the government says, to strictly regulate and restrict access to keep it away from children, we have a responsibility to ensure that we learn from our experiences with alcohol and tobacco and stop the aggressive promotion of marijuana products to young people before it begins. To quote David Hammond, professor of public health at the University of Waterloo, quote, "I struggle to think of any public health benefit to promoting these products. If the Liberals are serious about public health, they should enforce plain packaging. It's a good test of their commitment."
Ooh, plain packaging. Big fucking whoop. Plain packaging. Cool. I'm cool for that.
While the government claims that the design it unveiled earlier this week qualifies as plain packaging, they do not meet the World Health Organization's plain packaging standards.
So what about alcohol's plain packaging? Fuck off.
But marketing and promotion are only one side of the
now
equation.
You can buy like
equally important is our commitment to public
root beer
education
and fucking everything else with liquor in it.
Again, there are critical lessons to be learned from our past success. The federal tobacco control strategy has helped reduce smoke rates to an all-time low. Over the past 5 years, the federal government has devoted over $230 million to protect Canadians, especially young people, from the health consequences of tobacco use. Programs include extensive public education campaigns to prevent children and youth from starting to smoke themselves from secondhand smoke. The fact of the matter is, when done right, public education works. But this government has already fallen behind before legalization has even begun. Over the past year, we have heard clearly from American experts in states where cannabis is legal that public education programs must be in place to allow meaningful lead time before legal cannabis is made available. Yet, despite multiple funding announcements, a comprehensive public health campaign is still not yet underway. Honourable Senators, cannabis legalization was a 2015 campaign promise of this government. It is beyond comprehension that they have waited nearly 3 years and counting to take action on education. The evidence shows that fewer adolescents today believe that cannabis use has any serious health risks.
But it doesn't.
Imagine that. Fewer adolescents today believe that cannabis use has any serious health risks. Without immediate and sustained public education, legalization has the potential to normalize use. Furthermore, as the Canadian Medical Association has pointed out, government control over the source of cannabis for sale creates the perception that cannabis is safe to consume. Common sense suggests this will increase consumption going forward. We know what we need to do to improve our chances of success in reducing the
What island's that?
High-quality educational interventions, including skills-based training programs, social marketing interventions, and mass media campaigns. Education should focus not only on cannabis's general risks, but also on the specific harms to young people who use it. We cannot ignore the dangers of smoking. Most importantly, we need to do it now. The government's legalization agenda is divisive, and there are myriad challenges ahead. But in this moment, we must use the tools available to us to ensure that Canadians and their children are protected as best we can. Tobacco taught us valuable lessons about how to limit the youth appeal of a dangerous drug. Marketing and promotion must be heavily restricted, and public education must be comprehensive and far-reaching. In closing, honourable senators, let me say this. We've been told time and time again that Bill C-45 is first and foremost about harm reduction. If the government continues to insist upon pursuing legalization in order to meet its political commitments, it is our responsibility to ensure that the framework does, in fact, reduce the harm. Thank you.
Okay, so they dogged on it, and then they said, well, if it works, then cool.
Sénatrice Mégy.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Honorables sénatrices et sénateurs, je prends la parole aujourd'hui pour joindre...
Today I'm speaking to join my voice to those of several colleagues in this House. I would like to thank Senator Dean, who has invested a great deal of energy to share relevant data. Statistics from various reliable sources show that Canada is one of the countries with the highest prevalence of cannabis consumptions by youth under 20 years of age. I would like to speak about the social and health issues related to this situation. As you know, the human body creates its own cannabinoids, which are called endocannabinoids because they are produced inside the organism. These substances are a natural messenger. They transmit information regarding the state of the organism to both the brain and other organs. The endocannabinoid system mainly exists to regulate and create a stable environment within the human body. Namely, it is responsible for regulating appetite, coordinating motion, sensory perception, and pain perception. The active principles produced by the marijuana plant are also cannabinoids. Specifically, THC is one of the most important ones and has psychotropic effects, which is why cannabis is used for recreational purposes. These are called exogenous cannabinoids. There are almost 100 other cannabinoids that can be extracted from this plant, including CBD, which is often used for therapeutic purposes because it has no psychoactive effects. CBD is the object of a great deal of interest in the scientific world, given that it can be used to reduce epilepsy, including in children. There are promising studies currently being done on this subject. Both exogenous and endogenous cannabinoids use the same cerebral pathways, and their methods of actions are different and not very well known.
So now, this girl's THC educating the Senate
of endogenous cannabinoids and continue to do so for hours, which can cause an imbalance in the system. When it comes to therapeutic use, cannabis is increasingly promising and it's familiar to experts in chronic pain and palliative care. The anti-inflammatory and analgesic properties of cannabis makes it useful in the management of chronic pain, neuropathic pain, and painful muscular spasms, specifically very often in MS. It is also often used to control nausea and vomiting, which are the secondary effects of chemotherapy, and can also help to stimulate appetite in patients with AIDS. One of the products, the cannabinoid products used, has been marketed in the form of a nasal spray, or an oral spray rather, and there are two other synthetic cannabinoids called nabilone and dronabinol, which are sold in pills with well-defined dosages. And these products have received a compliance notice from Health Canada, given that they are based on clinical data and can be prescribed by doctors. A study published in the Journal of Pain in June 2016 showed that the use of cannabis in controlling chronic pain was associated with a decrease in opioid use of 64%. My colleagues who work in the field of chronic pain pointed out that for patients whose pain is not sufficiently alleviated by opioids, it was preferable to add small doses of cannabis while simultaneously diminishing the doses of opioids, which can avoid increasing the opioid use and preventing the secondary effects of this use. In this context, some people prefer to smoke the cannabis or use cannabis oil. Only a small group of doctors are able to prescribe these products. And the patient must also fill out an exemption form. A study published in 2014 in the Journal of the American Medical Association in Internal Medicine notes that the number of deaths linked to consuming opioids went down by 33% in 13 states where cannabis is legal, and this information was gathered over 6 years following the legalization of cannabis. Now, when it comes to the harms caused by cannabis in youth, some studies show that consuming marijuana is not as inoffensive as popular wisdom might seem to indicate. Since neurons only become fully mature at 25, it is clear that the adolescent brain is still vulnerable. Marijuana can cause psychosis, hallucinations, paranoia, the triggering of schizophrenia, and changes in cognition, as well as addiction. Dr. Romina Mizrahi, a director of a psychosis prevention clinic in Toronto, at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health at the University of Toronto, says that young people who are vulnerable to issues of mental health are twice as at risk of psychosis if they use marijuana, especially when a member of their family has a background with psychosis. And cannabis can lead to an acute phase of psychosis in adolescence, even if there are no previous events of mental illness. We have to establish a difference between a psychotic episode and schizophrenia. Psychosis is a temporary loss of contact with reality, which can be induced by being impaired by a substance like alcohol or drugs, or it can be a sign of the presence of mental illness like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or depression. However, it's not a permanent state. It can be treated, and most people can return to a satisfactory state of life. While schizophrenia is a brain disease which affects thought, feelings, and emotions, as well as the perceptions and behaviors of people with schizophrenia. However, these functions are not all affected at the same time or to the same extent. Many people with schizophrenia can behave in a completely normal way for long periods.
4:15, you got 4 minutes till 4:20. Newfoundland, first 4:20 in North America.
It generally occurs for the first time at the end of adolescence or at the beginning.
We're listening to the live Senate reading and voting on medical or on cannabis in Canada right now.
This coincides with the age where people generally start to use drugs. It has been identified in the literature that there is a personal predisposition, a genetic predisposition, an imbalance of brain metabolism which involves the dopamine and glutamate neurotransmitters and stressors as triggering factors for schizophrenia. So it's not as simple as to say that cannabis causes psychosis, but there is evidence that shows that If there is an existing vulnerability to psychosis, this is a factor which influences the link between consuming cannabis and psychosis. And there's also other factors like the amount of cannabis ingested, the concentration of the substance, the frequency.
Fuck, if you don't eat right, you go crazy.
Of consumption.
Mars Bars made commercials based on
one of my colleagues, a family doctor who works in an addiction clinic, told me that we need to do more work to determine why young people consume cannabis. Apart wanting to be part of a group, some young people say that they want to be able to concentrate more or to feel less shy in social situations. So doctors must also try to find any comorbidity like ADD, hyperactivity, depression, or predisposition to schizophrenia. These are all factors that make youth more vulnerable to developing deleterious effects after consuming cannabis. In order to ensure that care works, we need to ensure that we're also treating the comorbidity as well as the drug consumption. Raymond and Burnett from the Drug Policy Alliance have also raised the theory of self-medication, which states that the possibility that some people who are presenting psychotic symptoms start to treat themselves with cannabis before the psychosis is formally diagnosed. The authors show clearly that those who are going through psychosis or who have experienced psychosis are more likely to smoke cannabis. So it's hard to determine which of these two things happened first, the psychosis or the cannabis use. Then there are effects when an individual stops using cannabis after using a great deal. Only generally after a daily or almost daily consumption of cannabis for at least several months. And these symptoms manifest 24 to 72 hours after the last episode of cannabis use and can continue for 1 to 2 weeks. Sleep problems can continue up to about a month later.
No shit, people like their weed. Hurry the fuck up with this. What is this shit?
Apart from these acute effects that we just discussed, the literature can also occur after excessive consumption of alcohol, including, in many cases, coma or death. A paramedic told me that it's much more common to be called because of alcohol-induced psychosis than because of cannabis-induced psychosis. In 1971, the World Health Organization established a classification of psychotropic substances ranked by danger. Alcohol was the first one, then cocaine, and cannabis was only in the last place, 9th. But alcohol is a legal drug despite its very negative effects. And young people that I met with in a focus group last week told me that. Honorable Senators, regardless of our position on the legalization of marijuana, a number of our alarming facts can't be ignored. How do we reconcile what I've just mentioned with the fact that young people aged 12 to 17 will soon be able to possess up to 5 grams of cannabis? Why do you think young people have cannabis in their possession?
Because they want to feel better about life. What the fuck?
I, for one, thought that the legalization of cannabis was meant to stifle the black market, not encourage it. Add to that the possibility of growing marijuana at home. How will parents ever notice that 1 or 2 marijuana buds are missing from one of their 4 plants? What will they say when their 12-year-old suggests growing cannabis? It won't be legal after all. This is not a completely harm-free substance, and this could have an effect on all of society. Therefore, we have a duty to regulate and restrict access to cannabis. In order to justify home marijuana cultivation, many have compared it to making wine at home, which is legal. This argument is rather simplistic. Making wine is far more labor-intensive than
420!
Indeed, wine making requires a certain amount of knowledge.
420, folks!
It is difficult to make wine for personal consumption. Given the dangers of cannabis use, we must adopt a public health approach. In particular, we must at all costs delay the age at which individuals begin using cannabis.
She sounds like somebody for the conservatives or something.
To decrease the frequency of consumption.
I think she's like filibustering.
in order to reduce addiction problems. Moreover, we must ensure that non-consumers do not begin consuming cannabis simply because it is legal. To achieve these goals, we must make a collective effort to expand prevention programs while carrying out appropriately supported awareness and prevention campaigns. To ensure public safety, these measures must work in synergy with the communication strategies that are adopted. In addition to the usual media sources, we must also consider digital networks. Effective implementation entails taking the necessary time to ensure that legalization goes smoothly. After nearly a century of prohibition, people have the right to expect a smooth transition. In any event, our community should have the right to prepare for the new challenges they will face. Let's focus our energies on educating young people, parents, and families, and on training resources.
Yeah, let's be able to talk about marijuana now instead of it being taboo. Yeah, let's educate everybody on marijuana.
Be made aware of the dangers of addiction, impaired quality, and consumption. We also need a federal management framework to regulate the production, points of sale, quality, and safety of the products available on the market.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's open up a whole new line of jobs for people doing that shit. Create jobs for people regulating stuff. Yes.
It will be easier to report to researchers and physicians, and the data collected will be more reliable. And also they will be able to get more data. And this will also foster a better understanding of the effects of cannabis so that it can be used safely and so that potential health problems can be avoided. Honorable colleagues, let's take advantage of this momentum. Legalization will occur, but it should not be done at any cost. So let's take advantage of this moment to engage in deep and meaningful discussions in committee. Thank you.
Sénatrice Mégy, vous avez une question?
Senator Mégy, you have a question? Senator Galvez, rather. Yes, I will be happy to answer the question, says Senator Mégy. Senator Galvez, thank you very much for these very interesting remarks.
Go.
As a teacher, I have often spoken to students who have a hard time concentrating, and after discussion, they tell me that they started smoking cannabis in order to help them concentrate. And a few months later, it's more the opposite that has occurred. So when they tell me that they had a bad trip and that they felt anxiety and fear,
who's that? 2 cops?
like waking nightmare,
Bad trip? Jump in the
is that a
tree?
psychotic episode? Do you need 5 minutes, Senator? Agreed? Okay, 5 minutes.
She needs 5 minutes to answer a question?
I finished my question. Well, it's a chicken or egg situation. Sometimes people have symptoms. People are timid, they can't concentrate. Very often this is because of ADD. Now, if initially this person had gone right from the beginning to their family doctor, they would have not needed to use cannabis.
No, because they didn't run pills! Fuck off! Now you're hitting home.
Very, very banal, like an oral presentation in front of their class, but the young person is shy and smokes a joint, and after smoking a joint they feel good, so next time there's another activity in the classroom they smoke a joint again. So that's how this starts, their cannabis smoking behaviors start increasing.
And you don't take pills for that?
Understand about the situation of these people.
Soccer moms all across America don't take fucking clonazepams all day and fucking drive around?
ADD, that lowers the risk that they continue smoking cannabis until they have a bad trip. Does that answer your question?
They keep smoking until they have a bad trip.
Senator Moncion, do you have a question?
Wild.
Senator Mégy? Yes, I'm happy to answer the question. In your speech, and you just mentioned it, you mentioned the issue of alcohol. And you mentioned that the effects of alcohol are more harmful than the effects of cannabis. The same, but with alcohol, as has occurred recently in Quebec, it can lead to coma and death. Whereas with marijuana,
alcohol can lead to coma and
for
death.
Perhaps a very long time, but you're not going to end up in a state of coma or death unless they take marijuana, which is mixed with other drugs.
Yeah,
hard drugs
Marin
that
is a
they're not
pill,
aware of having taken.
fake weed, marijuana or
Given that critically,
Marinol or something.
it's illegal. They have to buy it somewhere where they're not familiar with what the content is.
Is this girl for or against
So
weed?
speaking of the content of marijuana,
What is she saying? I don't think
and once again, I know you have more medical expertise, alcohol is considered a toxin which affects the organs, our heart, kidneys, and liver. Marijuana is considered a neurotoxin. Can someone overdose on cannabis
No, there's never been a fucking...
compared to, for example, overdose of alcohol?
No, you can indeed
Yes,
die
both
from
are
alcohol
possible.
poisoning.
So when you drink too much alcohol, you're going to end up in a state of delirium at the hospital. If you take too much cannabis, you're also going to be at the
You're
hospital
going to
with
fall
psychosis.
asleep or get sick when you smoke too much weed. If you drink too much alcohol, you could actually die. It's called alcohol poisoning. Is it not? Am I not right about that?
You mentioned in your speech that the effects of cannabis
Mike.
in people who, in young people who are affected, are reversible, are usually reversible or reversible. But I know from personal experience that young people have severe brain damage from the use of cannabis that
What?
has not been reversible. So I'm not sure what you meant by that.
Severe brain damage from the use of cannabis. I want to see that. Is that a thing?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. Psychosis,
This
Acute
chick is the
psychosis.
interpreter. That's why.
when it occurs, is a transitory state, but the more profound deterioration, like the destruction of neurons, leaving school and other effects, that can have long-term effects, but it's acute psychosis that is only a temporary state.
If
Someone
I'm not
won't stay in a state
mistaken,
of psychosis for their entire life.
you have a brain cell,
Because
and
that
they have
happened,
an
that's a
electric
different
jump
phenomenon.
in the brain cell. It's called a synapses. When you get drunk, the brain cell dies. Alcohol, smoke cigarettes, it kills brain cells, kills it. But when you smoke weed and the cannabinoids get in your system, the cannabinoids engulf the brain cell and slow down the synapses.
Government bills. The opportunity to add our voices on legislation that proposes a major shift in Canadian public policy, such as the Cannabis Act, is the hallmark of this great chamber. And I'm very honored for this honor. Let me start by thanking our colleague, Senator Dean, who, as a sponsor of BC 45, promoted and encouraged an informed and inclusive review of a popular government initiative. Comme plusieurs de mes collègues qui ont parlé avant moi,
Like several of my colleagues, I've been considering this question ever since the last federal elections. Legalizing cannabis use for recreational reasons is now something that this chamber must urgently consider, and the government is exerting considerable pressure on our chamber. Marijuana use is an important subject, of which I only have a limited knowledge. However, I've been listening, I've informed myself, and I'm seriously concerned about some statements we've heard. Today, I would like to express the doubts that I have regarding the intention of this legislative measure, and also my significant concerns regarding the effect that this will have on youth and their health, repercussions on our schools, and the cultural perspective of our communities regarding this paradigm shift.
Okay, so you have concerns. Are there any fucking
Honorable
resolutions or solutions?
During our examination of the Cannabis Act, we must focus more on the risks represented by cannabis, marijuana consumption legalization for recreational purposes among youth in Canada. The legalization of marijuana has contributed to propagating the myth among youth that this substance is not harmful. The normalization of marijuana and its effect on young Canadians and the development of their brains is on the
Cannabis Corner today is going through this whole thing.
The potential risks are very high because adolescents do not know the true effects of this drug.
It's true. And adolescents
Research
don't really know
demonstrates
family
that
anymore
the
either.
average teenager naively thinks that marijuana can cure cancer, that it is less harmful than cigarettes, that it can strengthen the immune system, and that it is harmless and does not create addictions. This normalization and marijuana use levels
so
are
general, but
concerning,
that's not even,
mainly
that's not even
because
true.
the brains of those under the age of 25 are very sensitive. It is essential for us to understand this because regular consumption of marijuana will have harmful permanent impacts on brain development, and in particular on the socio-emotive development of members of this age group. According to the Canadian Psychology Association, high chronic cannabis use weakens the learning of oral language, memory, and attention. In some cases, the effects do not dissipate after cannabis is no longer used. A variety of studies show how regular marijuana or intensive marijuana use in adolescence is tied to lower school outcomes, lower income, suicidal tendencies, increased dependency on social assistance and employment insurance, as well as less satisfying relationships and life.
They're really glorifying the horrible points.
High exposure to THC can cause temporary symptoms associated with schizophrenia, like paranoia, cognitive deficiency, and even psychotic crises.
Paranoia because you don't know who the fuck is going to call
research
you a
reminds us
dickhead
that
for smoking some
marijuana
weed.
is the drug most often used by adolescents, more even than tobacco.
The government is proposing to restrict young people's access to marijuana and prohibit persons between the age of 12 and 17 from possessing or distributing more than 5 grams of cannabis under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. The question remains, how will this measure affect our youth? According to U.S. National Library of Medicine, the typical joint weight about 0.4 grams. Let's say we round the number to 0.5 grams. That would allow a minor to turn his or her legally possessed quantity of 5 grams into a total of 10 joints of any given day. I am surrounding that amount into individual joints to demonstrate how this prohibited limit is more than enough for any minor, someone between the age of 12 and 17, to consume enough marijuana on a daily basis to develop an acute cannabis problem.
I've been smoking weed since I was fucking 17, and I already have fucking problems.
Addiction
If I didn't smoke the weed, I'd be an alcoholic. I've got a diploma. I finished high school, no problem. I have a license. I did so much shit the past 10 years in fucking St. John's while I was smoking so much fucking weed people didn't even
So make no
know.
mistake, our youth will be the first victims of this bill, and a specific provision designed to help keep cannabis and cannabis products out of the hand of children. I am concerned that the debate of these legislations seem to give tacit approval to the idea that marijuana is not addictive. As a consequence, young people's perception of risk remains low. Although marijuana might not be as addictive as others, such as alcohol or other substances, I am concerned about the justification that have been given for the bill, which seem to encourage consumption, even though research indicates that wheat is harmful. There's a great lack of information in Canada about how these substances affect the brain development, but one thing is for sure. It is addictive.
I played
We are
basketball.
now realizing the magnitude
I jumped
of this
to
addiction
take a
problem
shot 10
among our
times.
youth. We
And
need
of the
to
10
take this
times I
into
jumped to
account,
take a shot, I fell
because
down
more
twice.
teens are now smoking marijuana
And out of the twice I
than
fell down, I
cigarettes.
hurt my ankle once.
Marijuana is the number one
So basketball is
reason why
harmful for your
adolescents
ankle.
seek substance abuse treatment in the United States. According to the Arapahoe House Treatment New York network
Playing
in
basketball is
Colorado,
harmful to your health.
teenage admission for marijuana addiction in Colorado increased by 66% between 2011 and 2014, correlating with legalization of the recreational use of marijuana.
Now I'm out of weed.
The National Survey of Drug Use and Health indicates that people who begin using marijuana before the age of 18 are 4 to 7 times more likely to develop a marijuana use disorder than adults. Honorable Senators, according to the Canadian Centre of Substance Abuse, cannabis use among high school students is a national pattern with long-term impacts to their health, motivations, and future. As a former teacher, when I read this research, I cannot help but think how this legislation will affect our young students and impact our school.
The young
If
students
we
are
look at
up
the
on
American
it.
example again, in 2015 survey, of 95 school resource officers, 90% respond that they have seen an increase in marijuana-related incidents in their school since marijuana legalizations. In a similar survey of 180 school counselors, 69% respond that since marijuana legalization, they have seen an increase in marijuana-related incidents to their school. I will say it again. These facts are especially important given that Canadians under 18 are big fans of the drugs, which about 26,000 Ontario teenagers using it daily, according to Canadian Association of Mental Health. In 2013, UNICEF found that Canadian youth were the biggest pot smoker among the world's 29 richest countries. Senator Harder explained yesterday how this statistic about cannabis consumption among young Canadians fluctuates over time. However, Canadian survey consistently indicate a national pattern in cannabis use among our youth, which remain alarming overall. Without greater awareness, recreational marijuana use in adolescents will have implications for academic functioning as well as social and occupational function and standing into life. Honorable Senators, throughout the years, I have attended several town hall meetings in communities across the country to address various policies concerned, including the upcoming legalization of marijuana, to grab a better understanding of their views. There was a litany of concern expressed by the members of the community I visited in Montreal, Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, and Vancouver about this upcoming change. Like many other naturalized Canadians who are following the debate of this bill, I see legalizing a drug for people's enjoyment is an absurd subject to legislate.
What?
No one in the town hall meeting welcomed this legislation. The community members I met with had serious concern about health impact, and they share their worries about youth. For many of these communities, legalizing cannabis is almost perceived as an attack on their youth and their health.
What?
They are afraid of seeing new stores opening, neighbors growing their own plants, and their young children have easy access.
But they're doing that
Older
already.
generation expressed their concern about how this commonly used drugs in Canada is already impacting our younger generation and new Canadians.
You
While
take their
Bill
pot away and give them
C-45 is a
booze, they're going to want more guns, and we're going to become the states.
I have noticed that Asian Canadian experience with legalization has been underappreciated. Much more awareness is needed in this community because substance abuse problem has been largely minimized or denied because of the stereotype of Asian Canadian as model community. This should be a concern. because Canadians of Asian origin represent 17.7% of the Canadian population, according to 2016 census, and are one of Canada's fastest growing populations group as a result of immigration. In this community, it is important to understand that people do not tend to seek help, mainly because there's a stigma associated with substance use in Canadian Asian community. Because of this cultural stigma, many Asian Canadians are not yet ready to openly discuss substance use problem. Community associate this type of drug with insanity, loss of moral responsibility.
Asian people are associating cannabis with insanity.
Consequently, cultural responses to substance abuse,
I think that's what he just implied
and the
right
use
there.
of marijuana are heavily influenced by the sense of shame and the fear of losing face and disgracing family members. Because of the fear of losing face, substance users and their family usually attempt to resolve the problem on their own. Seeking outside professional help is commonly considered as a last resort.
Is that what he just...
Currently,
Maybe
the availability of culturally appropriate and a sensitive continuum of care for substance abuse treatment for Asian Canadian populations is simply lacking, perhaps with the exception of a few major metropolitan cities. Honorable Senators, I believe that we are entitled.
Ottawa Senators.
I believe we are entitled to our own opinion, but not our own facts. There is no denying that health risk that legalizing marijuana will pose for our youth and our school system. The government promised $36.4 million over 5 years for public awareness. Yet we know that the value of the legal cannabis market is back about $22.6 billion. We should not pinch pennies when it comes to mitigating the impact that legalization will have on our youth, and the current approach sends a dangerous message to our community.
So it sounds like he's trying to use the budget cannabis is going to make,
substance,
but he doesn't want
the
it.
government must do its utmost to ensure a proper awareness campaign is in place for Canadian youth who continue to use cannabis and at some highest rate in the world. Under this version,
And
I cannot
there's
support this bill.
schools that have cannabis
And we fully are
cultivation
duty
in
as
it
the
now.
House of
How are they
so
not
much
getting
thought.
facts from the schools that are teaching this in Canada already?
Standing committees will examine the impact of these current legislations will have on our well-being of our youth and consider the contextual barriers for ethno-cultural populations. I look forward to hearing their findings at the report stage and to continue participating in this debate. Thank you.
So I'm not sure what exactly you're trying to get at, right?
Senator Andrzejczyk on debate.
Thank you. Honorable colleagues, I hope I'm not going to take over the mantle of Senator Baker, who would stand up and say, I'll only say a few words. My intention is to only say a few words, so correct me if I go on a bit longer. I want to applaud all of the senators who've entered in this debate. I think that is the Senate at its finest.
Asian culture's been using fucking cannabis since like the beginning of time.
From so many perspectives. And I did have my speech with my findings, but I thought it's been done adequately. So what I really want to do is touch a few points that are important to me and points that I haven't heard as much about. So I want to associate myself with all the honorable senators who have raised concerns about this bill. One reason that I have concerns about this bill is that I believe the government has the right to introduce whatever legislation it wishes, but in a modern society such as Canada, it has a responsibility to put forward a strategy, to cost it out, to time plan it, and to make sure that the public is aware sufficiently so that they can have a reasoned and fulsome debate in the community.
Make sure the Canada's aware we're about to legalize cannabis. Make sure they're aware.
Was made in a platform of a party, and after there was an announcement to proceed, but it has been very piecemeal, and I think that those that were engaged and wish to change the laws of marijuana have been involved to a certain extent. Others are just coming forward. Had there been the kind of governance model that I think we're used to. I pine for the old days when we used to have white papers and green papers where people could really respond and engage. Granted, there may have been stakeholder meetings, there may have been some focus groups, but I don't think the Canadian public on something that will fundamentally change the life have been involved. And I think that will be the crucial point that we will face in the future. And I want to put some other points on. I've heard this, that medical marijuana is here, but we are now going to go into recreational use.
You mean?
And recreational use will make, by regulation, a safer product. Well, that may be, but the people I've dealt with in my past are the most vulnerable. I wouldn't say that they use drugs for recreation. They often use drugs for desperation. And they are the ones that perhaps will continue with marijuana on the street because the black market will not go away, or they'll change to other drugs and other ways to cope. I have heard very little debate from the government or others how we will deal with the most vulnerable communities. Those that I used to see in social services, those that I see on the streets, those that are in poverty.
You're going to deal with them the same way you deal with lottery tickets and fucking booze. You're going to let them spend their money on fucking weed however they want with their check, because if they want to fucking spend money on weed and go fucking hungry, that's their own choice. If someone wants to fucking be on assistance and not feed their family with the assistance they get,
what was illegal?
Well, what's
to legal?
We're chicken or egg?
The difference that I look at
money management, or they bought weed. Like fuck.
The government has some responsibility through the criminal courts, through legislation. But once it switches to the government will have the responsibility to ensure the...
To me, right there, what she's saying is, she's like, oh, these communities of people are lower people.
To the Convention of the Rights
They're
of the
stupid.
Child, and where we said
we're targeting them because they're going to buy more marijuana.
In fact, protect the health
because she has experience in some sort of social
we know maturing
services
minds
like
are difficult
job.
to deal with. Canada will now have an obligation
She's classifying
in a way
people
that it has not had before. And I haven't heard too much what kind of support services we will give to families in crisis when this occurs. Yes,
like the ones that are in crisis now for little minor misdemeanor fucking pot charges that ruin,
we
like,
understood what fetal alcohol syndrome did to children. It is a lifelong sentence, not only for those children, but their families.
On fetal alcohol syndrome.
The same could happen from what I've heard from the very kind senators who did all the research. We really don't know the full consequences of marijuana. Yet, we are going to say, as a government and as a society, if we pass this bill, that's okay. We will monitor it. We are going to experiment and test on future generations without, I think, the proper analysis, the proper supports.
And now they're calling it a test?
Analysis that goes with the dollars. We know in addiction, we know in alcohol, we give some money, and it looks like a lot, but it's not.
Called a financial report.
Most of the money gets directed to general revenue, and I think that will be a shame. Education, everyone has touched on education, but I thought that we were traveling with the National Finance Committee, and we raised this issue with Minister Friesen, Finance Minister in Manitoba. And here's his quote on December 8th, 2017. He said, if we want to do this well, implementing marijuana, we require adequate time Mistakes are going to be made here, and Canadians
that's why you
should be
put
disabused
it off
of any
July
notion
1st.
to the contrary. Like it or not, cannabis will be legal. And he was speaking before the July 2nd date was perhaps in question. But he went on to say, our premier spoke to the governor of Colorado, and he said, if we had only more time. He reflected on one point. Looking back now, we had no idea. When you look at the morbidity rates, injury and deaths on highways, mental illness and suicide rates amongst youth, there is so much to get right. We
Okay, so what is that rate in Colorado then? What is that figure? Did people,
education campaign.
Did people start driving off the road more?
I'm a former educator.
I believe things dropped in Colorado and revenue went up.
But to truly teach and change behavior takes a long time. Youth need to hear this message again and again and again. My difficulty is that I've heard from the government, we will do this. We have a campaign, we're preparing, we are planning. Yet, we are months from what the government anticipates will be law. There is no time to prepare adequately, and that concerns me.
They make it out to be like the apocalypse or something.
Not a question of whether their policy is the right one.
They make it out like people don't already use cannabis.
I also have an issue. Prime Minister recently said that his approach to Aboriginals in our communities will be on a rights-based approach. Yet, most of the Aboriginal community I deal with have not been consulted and have not had their full say. Is this the rights-based approach that we are offering?
Well,
and one other area, international obligations. We know that there are 3 conventions that will be violated and perhaps more. Foreign Affairs and International Trade is just starting our study on this. We know that Canada has been on the forefront of saying no reservations on any international convention, no pulling out. We have built over decades an international network of conventions, and we've been on the vanguard to say, no, you can't pick and choose, because when we come to, and often it's a watered down consensus on a convention, we want to strive and have people adhere to those conventions and the declarations and the protocols. We are now moving off.
Right? Weed's being legalized, yeah, the apocalypse.
It may be that some way will be found, but we know that very limited measures are in place. Very little thought has been given. How do we get out of this conundrum? We're now facing a world where our international norms are at risk. We know the countries who do not wish the norms and values that we've set out, who don't adhere to the International Covenant on Human Rights. We've built up at least some semblance of an international order. We risk now, for the first time, either having to pull out and provide a reservation,
I haven't heard
one
person in favor yet.
Signaling for the first time in many decades
that someone that
we do
got
not
something nice to
have
say
the
speak.
full respect of these agreements that we have signed. And I think it's very crucial in this world.
She pulled out the old fucking...
My final point is that I was here when Senator Nolan was here. Senator Nolan and I did not agree. I did not want to legalize marijuana. He did. He convinced the Senate to have a study. But there has been this myth that it is a Senate study. He started the study. He was given the resources, and he did an adequate job on that. When the report was tabled in the chamber here, there was no appetite to approve it.
I missed Nova Scotia 420 also.
Gave notice of an inquiry and spoke to it. That inquiry did not proceed.
I'm all out of cannabis also.
Order paper in prorogation. And I must say that I think we should all read it, because it wasn't a conclusion of legalizing marijuana. It was a conclusion of strategies of how to get there. There are some excellent, excellent roadmaps that if we had followed, perhaps all of us could have lived with the change in our society. It is thoughtful, it includes society, and I have gone just recently from recommendation 1 to recommendation 11. If only we had followed Senator Noland's report, we would not be in this difficult situation of being asked to pass a law without what I call the homework from a government being done. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Oh, what the fuck? They still do that?
Senator Martin on debate.
Thank you, Your Honor. Honorable Senators, I rise also today to speak at second reading of Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. So much has been said already, and like Senator Andrzejczyk, I chose to highlight a few additional points that I felt were not as fully discussed. But I want to first commend both the sponsor, our critic, Senator Carignan, the committees that are currently looking at portions of this very important bill for our chamber, and all the senators and their staff who have supported the research, the drafting,
And their staff. I would like to
other
thank.
work that we do.
I
every
would
day,
like to thank
including my own.
Problems or Solutions. Good,
I have
thank
looked
you.
at this bill carefully,
Okay.
and the objectives that are outlined as the goals of this legislation are really important ones. And I agree to these objectives in writing: to prevent young persons from accessing cannabis, to protect public health and public safety by establishing strict product safety and product quality requirements, and to deter criminal activity by imposing serious criminal penalties for those operating outside the legal framework.
Well,
The act
see?
is also intended to reduce the burden on the criminal justice system in relation to cannabis. That I am fully aware of as a former educator. My husband is still a teacher in British Columbia working with youth at risk, so he knows what challenges these youth have faced and continue to face when it comes to the legal system. So I understand this issue is one that we are grappling with because it has been imposed on us in terms of a timeline that is trying to be met. But as a chamber where we know that it is so important, as Senator Andrzejczyk has expressed, that the homework must be done, and we have to ensure that
It's like you haven't
if we
done
are
your
going
homework
to
yet.
make
What the
something
fuck?
as historic and as
Scholars in the
serious
room and
as
they're dragging their ass
C-45
across
that
the fucking floor,
Canadians,
waiting for people to
Canadian
die.
society
Scholars in the
must be
room,
ready.
waiting for people to fucking die. Buddy had a bong here, huh?
So physicians and pediatricians are concerned about the effects of cannabis use on brain
Buddy just went
development
and hit a vape
and
out
on
in the
mental
fucking
health. I want
bathroom.
to
He's
thank
like,
Senator Major for her expertise and what she has put on record today.
fuck this boring shit. I get to the
Provincial, territorial, and municipal governments are not
holds it in, so we got to ghost the big
yet
old
prepared
toke.
for legalization based on conversations I had with
Goes like that.
Our
Narp
Minister
smoke
of
there.
Public Safety just a few weeks ago said to me, "Can you wait? We're not ready." And yet I hope that they will appear before committees, or at least respond to committees about what they are doing. What is the state of preparedness in each of our provinces? For me in British Columbia, and my question to our provincial leaders would be, what consultations have happened with municipalities? Because I also have spoken to city councillors and mayors who are very concerned
Ooh,
about
so that makes you better than everybody
conversations
else.
that have taken place about revenue sharing.
She went to
But
Vancouver
the
Mayor's
lack of
office and talked to Vancouver
consultation and
Mayor.
conversation around burden sharing, or all of the effects, the negative effects that municipalities will have to deal with on the ground. how will they be able to really support the changes that will happen if they are not adequately funded, nor discussions have taken place on very important, sharing of responsibilities that will have to happen with provinces and municipalities. So I hope that councillors or municipalities will also be responding to our committee when they are looking at this legislation, should it pass today. Police and law enforcement agencies are not yet equipped to deal with the burden of this legislation.
No,
we're aware of that.
I don't suppose they are.
And we know that that will have to be very, very carefully addressed.
I don't suppose
But
they
also
are.
the Canadian military. I was at a regimental dinner and sat next to a commanding officer.
Canadian
who talked
military.
about,
What is she going to say?
for himself as a soldier of many decades, that there's been a zero tolerance policy on this. And so what will happen with legalization? He is hoping that the Army, the Canadian military, will continue with the same policies, but these are all details about that will have to be carefully
And that's fucked,
worked out.
because
And what happens
Veterans
when-
Affairs pays
So
for
what
every veteran's
he said
medical
that
marijuana
the
prescription.
government has invested $100,000, I haven't verified, but on getting virtual reality goggles to help the military personnel experience what it would be like to be under the influence of cannabis
What?
on the job. So as I was listening to this,
I'm sorry, I gotta laugh at that.
very worrisome about how everything will be carefully rolled out if it is rushed. And if there haven't been conversation about this, so
She's all stressed
still
about
waiting for
getting
certain
goggles
details and
for
directions. I think that
the
is
government.
a very important consideration.
The army. Getting weed goggles
And there
for
are
the
many
army.
other stakeholders who
Get the
have
weed
also
goggles out
weighed in. We have,
for the army.
seen media reports. We have received letters and emails. And this afternoon, I met with a foreign diplomat who is returning to Korea after 5.5 years abroad. He was in the United States and in Canada for 3 years. And he was worried about Korean nationals coming to Canada and Canadians visiting or working and living in Korea because of the laws of Korea that are that
We're worried about
have
cannabis. The
marijuana
cannabis
as an
Korean
illegal
relations.
substance. And
That's
there's
what we're
very
worried about
severe
with Korea.
consequences. So
Cannabis relations.
I thought it
This
would
is
be very important to look
wicked.
at the punishments that Canadians could face in either intentionally or unintentionally traveling with purchasing or using
Hurts.
cannabis outside of Canada, which I would hope that our embassies, consulates, and
Don't go to
all the
Korea to
officials
smoke
that
cannabis,
are
alright?
working outside of Canada with Canadians
Japan.
traveling to such some very popular destinations and or working in other places, that these conversations as well as preparations have been made.
Next page.
So in 2017, a report entitled Cannabis Legislation in Europe was published by the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, discussing cannabis in a European Union context. And according to the report, possession of cannabis for personal use can lead to incarceration in the UK, France, Germany, among many other European Union countries, even in the more liberal-leaning Scandinavian EU members, including Sweden, Norway, and Finland. The penalties for possession of cannabis for personal use include
His
incarceration.
buddy again hitting his vape
And while
pen.
European countries vary in their punishments for possession, production, and trafficking in cannabis, there are many countries that have
Sitting
even
in
more
the Senate,
severe
vaping his
punishment
pen.
for similar crimes. In Saudi Arabia, penalties range from imprisonment to execution. In the United Arab Emirates, the punishment is a mandatory prison sentence. A fellow Commonwealth country in South Africa, the use, possession, or production of cannabis in public is illegal. And China, a G7 partner to Canada, enforces the illegality of cannabis domestically, with punishment ranging from a short prison sentence, fine, or deportation. So going back to Korea, because of conversations that I've had with members of the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I know that there was a recent release that stated, in accordance with the nationality principle, all Koreans should follow the Korean law. The Korean government will step up inspections of people who come from Canada and their belongings, as well as all packages from the country. Please be aware that Koreans could face serious legal consequences for having or using it. Now, of course, we are Canadians, and we are most concerned about the impact of this legislation on Canadians and Canadian lives. But, you know, we talk about being part of the global community, and with the kind of work that I do with various countries being part of bilateral, multilateral groups, I think we have to look at what our legislation will do in impacting, you know, our partners and other jurisdictions and Canadians who travel to those places. So in Korea, the penalty for possession of cannabis is up to 5 years of imprisonment or a fine of $60,000 Canadian.
Can you imagine?
This law applies to both Korean nationals and foreigners on Korean soil and Korean nationals on foreign soil.
I'm sure you have a lot of nice people, but because of that, I'm never going to Korea.
Senator Andrzejczyk spoke about the UN treaties to which we are a signatory, and I was thinking about, you know, our commitments to our world partners and what we have already committed to.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not racist, and I don't mean like fuck you, Korea.
Share as well, along with some of the other concerns that have been raised in various speeches. And so, honorable senators, as you can see, the international community has various laws and punishments related to cannabis use, possession, and trafficking, with Canada being the first G7 country to legalize cannabis. This represents new territory, not only for Canadians, but for our foreign service that is responsible for representing Canadians internationally and ensuring their safety abroad. And on a very personal level, I have heard a lot of concerns raised about our youth. And as an educator, had spent quite a bit of time with youth and young adults, middle school, but largely high school students. As a teacher, we always talk about authentic assessment, and we do give tests, and with the grades will reveal in that moment perhaps the student's lack of preparation and lack of completion of assignments, so the numbers do tell a certain truth. But we also look at anecdotal evidence as part of our assessment, because that
citing how a teacher in the box system
reveals
quantizes stuff. Who cares?
That cannot be measured through a test. So though we look at various numbers, whether or not youth are using more marijuana or using less, those numbers will fluctuate, as others have said. But on an anecdotal level, I can just tell you that in all my years of teaching, I cannot think of a single student who, because of habitual use of marijuana, that it helped in their studies. If anything, I have seen too many students who were not able to complete school, drop out unnecessarily, and that it became a habitual use of marijuana. It may not be addictive.
Okay, well, what about alcohol and pill abuse and other shit? What about that also?
State of being for them, if they're escaping, conflict situations in their home or in their lives, that they use that for escape, and that did affect what was happening. And I'm trying to imagine teachers in schools where in my
Let's try to imagine teachers in schools having guns now.
High. There are
Johnny's out smoking a joint.
Like what the inconsistency of what teachers can do if a student is of legal age, in some provinces if they set the age at 18, and those who are not. And as you know, with youth, if the legal age is 18, we know that there will be kids close to 18 or even several years before, and they'll just be exposure to this.
They're exposed now.
That at this time is illegal.
I moved to London when I was fucking
legal.
15.
So there's a lot of concern around that. And as I was
I seen weed then.
reviewing some of documents that, well, the mountain of documents that we all have looked through, the Library of Parliament sent us a legislative summary for C45. And on page 1 of the document, there's an overview of cannabis and its health effects. And I read this again late last night. If I may just refresh your memories as well.
Cannabis and its effects, filibuster.
Cannabis is the common name for a hemp plant belonging to the genus Cannabis that grows in temperate and tropical climates. The leaves and the flowering tops of cannabis plants contain almost 500 distinct compounds, the principal ones being delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, cannabinol, THC, cannabidiol, and cannabinol. Sorry about my pronunciation. Of these compounds, THC is responsible for many, if not most, of the euphoric and addictive effects of cannabis. According to the World Health Organization,
and healing properties
can have both short and long-term effects. In the short term, cannabis use can impair cognitive functioning and motor coordination.
Cannabis made me hungry.
Interfere with.
Is it agreeable, honourable senators? 5 more minutes.
Which can interfere with driving and increase the risk for injuries. More
Cutting her
generally,
off.
a minority of first-time users may experience anxiety and psychotic symptoms. Acute exposure may also lead to heart attack and stroke in some at-risk individuals. Long-term use can result in cannabis abuse or dependence in approximately 9% of regular users. However, this risk increases to 16% among individuals who would begin using cannabis in adolescence.
They cause heart attack on your
With respect to cognitive function, individuals who initiate cannabis use in adolescence may also experience more lasting impairments to memory, concentration, and other cognitive functions. In addition, maternal use during pregnancy has been shown to affect the development of children's cognitive functioning, behavior, substance abuse, and mental health. Finally, long-term cannabis use may also play a role in the development of a broad range of other health conditions, such as mental illness, respiratory diseases, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. However, there is limited or inconclusive evidence in these areas.
However, there's little
it may be
or inconclusive.
These notes were in our briefing document, and they are very, very alarming.
She just fucked her whole thing up there by saying that last sentence at the end.
I'm proud of our record of excellence.
However, these results are inconclusive.
But I know the legalization of marijuana makes Canada an outlier in the world. We will be only the second country to fully legalize marijuana.
Spain.
And the first in the G7. I hope Canada will remain an outlier and that the world will not follow us in this regard. But today, after having heard all the debate to this point and sharing the concerns that have been expressed, I wanted to add these words to the record and explain why I will be on principle voting against C45 at second reading.
Do you have a question, Senator Rain?
Honourable Senator, take a question.
Senator Martin, do you take a question? Senator Rain.
Thank you. I hadn't thought before I heard your speech about all the impacts it will have with our relationship with so many countries that have chosen to take a completely different approach to marijuana. And having been the Chancellor of the Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, where we have a very active program in bringing in foreign students as part of our university population. Has there been any study, have you seen anything on the unintended consequences that this policy would have on the recruitment of foreign students to augment the experience at Canadian universities?
Yeah, they don't use cannabis, they can come here. Nothing to change.
I haven't seen any studies related to this, but when I met with the foreign diplomat this afternoon and we were talking about Koreans visiting Canada and Canadians going to Korea, he did express great concern, and you know, it's an illicit drug, it's illegal in Korea, and there's some very severe penalties as I outlined, and so the Foreign Affairs Ministry has added this warning to all Koreans traveling to Canada and Canadians going to Korea. So I think that our neighbors, our partners around the world, watching this carefully, they will have to issue such statements, I would think, and look at this carefully. And it will, I think, students coming to Canada.
Trump is watching this now, laughing.
The jurisdiction into which they will return.
Betcha.
And these are all very serious considerations that we should be making. Thank you.
No, I take that back. Trump's probably fucking playing golf or something, so he didn't give a fuck with this.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable colleagues. I rise today to speak on Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. I stand here not necessarily to speak for or against this legislation, as much as I am to speak up for some of the people who are not in this chamber, who do not have the platform that we have, but who may be more affected by this legislation than any of us. I'm speaking about the children and the youth of our country. Colleagues, nothing I've heard in this debate or discussion so far on this legislation assures me that we're putting them and their interests first, yet we plot their future. I do not wish to disparage the intention of anyone who feels that this legislation improves the current situation. But in my opinion, and in the opinion of the many parents and educators, law enforcement and municipality officials in Newfoundland and Labrador, and indeed across Canada, as well as those in the medical profession I've spoken to about C-45, I fear that this bill will be doing more harm than good. There are real and practical concerns about the health risks of cannabis use.
Who is this?
Where people will be allowed to smoke these newly legalized products, and what messages we are sending to children and their parents. Listening to the government, it seems that tax revenue and revenue for producers and distributors are more important than protecting children. The government is choosing money over health, growth and development of what we often call our most valuable resource, and our people, and in particular, our young people. I also take issue with the soft truths that proponents of this legislation give, that they are doing us a favor by legalizing a drug which at a population level is, quote, less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. My question is it good or bad, better or worse, for children and young people to breathe marijuana smoke? Would it be better for their growth and development, their dreams and their career ambitions, for their physical health and well-being, and for their families? Colleagues, I know that this legislation still does not permit children to smoke marijuana or youth to smoke marijuana, yet by legalizing it, I believe it will clearly give greater access. It will be subject to the devastating effects of the secondhand smoke. We know many things about the harms associated with cannabis, and I quote Health Canada's April 2017 publication, The Health Effects of Cannabis. The publication talks about the short-term effects on the brain from use of cannabis that can include confusion, fatigue, impaired memory and concentration, anxiety, fear, panic, and even delusions and hallucinations. It also notes that the longer-term effects on the brain from use of cannabis can include an increased risk of addiction, impairment to memory, concentration, intelligence, as well as impairment of one's ability to think clearly and to make decisions. It has been shown that frequent and heavy use of cannabis can affect brain development in children and adolescents. As we have heard, studies have shown brain development continues to 25
Cannabis
years
made me fucking hungry.
I hope you can see why so many parents are having difficulty believing the line that this will be better and this legislation is good for Canada. How are we supposed to explain to their children when our message is that it's suddenly okay to smoke marijuana? In fact, we're going to make it legal for their parents and older siblings to smoke marijuana. And colleagues, there is a reason why it's called dope. Canada has become a leader in the production and distribution of commercial marijuana products.
Why is it called dope? What's that reason?
I commend the medical community and those in business who have spearheaded and developed this new positive industry. However, just because we've become good at growing, it doesn't deal with the basic problems that underlie this legislation. The recreational marijuana market is estimated to be $22 billion a year. So we're going to have a minimalist and as yet defined public education campaign versus this massive new industry, which will no doubt find ways to advertise and promote their products. Our cloudy message to young Canadians is going to be, don't smoke marijuana. Meanwhile, down the road or across the street, you can legally buy it, and we've put the legal and moral stamp of the federal government on it. The real message is that there is nothing wrong with it. In the government's opinion, without this legislation,
There
rates
isn't.
of Canadians smoking marijuana will increase. However, they offer no such guarantee that rates will decrease as a result of Bill C-45. If and when this legislation becomes law, it should only happen after a long period of massive public education and awareness. In the meantime, children, youth, and parents will try to deal with the very real impact that this legislation will have on their lives, their schools, and their communities.
We are educated.
One of those impacts
You
is
are
likely
not.
going to be an increase in impaired driving. As my colleague Senator Manning has pointed out, the experience in Colorado should be instructive. He quotes numbers that state the legalization has doubled the number of drivers involved in fatal crashes who tested positive for marijuana, and in high school, the drug violations have increased 71%. Why is this not the subject matter? While this is not the subject matter of this legislation, it should concern us. We will have more people killed on our roads and our highways, and the innocent law-abiding drivers and those walking on the sidewalks will be injured and will be killed. And we in this chamber may be contributing to that. That is not a debatable item to parents in Colorado. It is a fact, and it will be a fact here in Canada. The bottom line of this debate should not be measuring how much of the marijuana money will be made or how the proceeds will be divided. It should be based on good public policy that minimizes the risk and maximizes protection. Colleagues, the government's stated goal is to keep marijuana out of the hands of criminals and youth. But hidden away in Division 1, Section 8, Sub 1C is a clause stating, youth ages 12 to 17 will be able to possess up to 5 grams of dry cannabis before facing criminal charges. Colleagues, to me, this is shocking. I want to close my remarks on this legislation by referring to a couple of documents that have been prepared by organizations with some expertise in health matters affecting youth. And we've heard some of those some of those reports already today.
Man, I wish I had more cannabis right now.
Association position statement written in 2017 on this issue says that there needs to be a focus on children and young people because mental health disorders and substance abuse often start in this age group. They note that cannabis is the most widely used drug among Canadian youth, with 22% of 15 to 19-year-olds admitting to having used it in the past year. They go on to say that regular use of cannabis by youth can have negative effects on, quote, cognition, including attention, memory, processing speed, visuospatial functioning, and overall intelligence. Early use of cannabis by young people increases the likelihood of developing a primary psychotic illness among those who are vulnerable. The Canadian Psychiatric Association calls for cannabis to be legalized only for those over 21 years of age and suggests that limits on its potency and quantity should apply until the age of 25. The Canadian Psychiatric Association also identifies an increased risk of schizophrenia and depression, as well as the earlier onset of symptoms of psychosis and bipolar disorder among young people regularly using cannabis. Additionally, colleagues, there is a paper from the Canadian Pediatric Society entitled Cannabis and Canada's Children and Youth. It states that, quote, cannabis use during adolescence can cause functional and structural changes to the developing brain, leading to damage. It also writes,
which can lead to damage,
youth
maybe.
Ranked first for cannabis use among 43 countries and regions across Europe and North America, with 1/3 of youth, regardless of gender, having tried cannabis at least once by the age of 15. Their conclusion states, quote, youth should not use cannabis recreationally because it has many potentially harmful effects that are serious. These effects are present in the entire population. However, the developing brain is especially sensitive to the negative consequences of cannabis use. Canadian youth are at significant risk for developing cannabis use disorder and possibly for doubling their risk of having a psychotic illness. Driving under the influence of cannabis increases the risk for motor vehicle accidents, and we know that cannabis use affects judgment. Where cannabis has been legalized in the USA, children are requiring emergent medical care at greater rates due to unintentional ingestion. Colleagues, that's not my opinion, that's from the report.
That's from the report. Folks, that's not my opinion, that's from the report.
I like that one. Here in the Senate to help us understand the severity of the impact of any decision that we make with this proposed legislation. If there was ever a time for the Senate to exercise its capacity for sober second thought, it is now. Thank you.
Folks, that's not my opinion, that's the report.
Senator Lankin, you have a question?
Yes.
Senator Wells, would you accept a question?
Sorry, who's the question from? Oh, sorry, Senator Lang.
Now you better say.
Well then, no. Yes, I'll accept the question.
My friend and colleague, thank you very much for taking the question. I appreciate the entirety of the case that you put forward, and I don't want to diminish from that by zeroing in and asking a question on one point. I share many of the same concerns that you have. I come from a probably different end perspective in terms of my belief that the war on drugs has not worked and that we need a public health approach. Whether or not this one makes the grade, I think, is what is being discussed. But when you said that you found a clause hidden, that I don't think it's hidden, but that
it's not hidden. We all know about it.
Criminalize young people for possession under a certain amount. You talked about it as that you were shocked that they wouldn't be charged criminally. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they're still subject to offense, but a provincial offense as opposed to a criminal code offense. Are you suggesting that it would be better in the context of this to actually criminalize those young people?
Question, Senator Lang, not at all, not at all. But by defining it like that, it gives tacit approval to have it, and that's my concern about it. And I did find it hidden there. I don't know if you've ever read an omnibus bill. There are lots of things hidden in there. This is a bill that covers the full gamut, but doesn't go far enough in many cases of the marijuana legislation, legalization legislation. The fact that it's in there and states, why doesn't it say from age 1 to age 17? I think that
it should, in case fucking some children have a prescription for it.
State it is illegal to have it. It gives tacit approval to use it or to have it, and to have it means to use it or sell it or.
No, it doesn't mean sell it.
Senator Boisvenu, on débat.
Merci beaucoup. Senator Boisvenu on debate. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before beginning to speak to Bill C-45, I'd like to apologize for the use of an inappropriate expression when I was striving to describe this drug. I used the expression when I was discussing the bill, and I would like to apologize for that. This is a very emotional subject for me, as some individuals very close to me had their lives destroyed due to the use of this drug. Honorable Senators, I would like to speak today to Bill C-45, a bill which raises more questions than it gives answers. I'd like to be very clear. I would not at all like to call into question the legitimacy for this government to proceed with legalization of marijuana. Ever since this bill was tabled in the other place, I have taken part in various discussions in Canadian media, and on various occasions, I have seen that parents are very concerned about the negative impacts of legalization of this drug. I would also like to mention my colleague Claude Carignan's excellent work, as well as the entire Legal Affairs Committee. What I've seen is that the more we study this bill, the more we find major and unacceptable gaps when it comes to realizing its objectives, which are protecting youth from cannabis use and ensuring that organized crime does not participate in this sector. As a parent and grandparent, I cannot support this bill in its current form. The more I look
20 minutes till 4:20 in Ontario.
Completely rewritten. This is crucial for the safety of our youth and for our entire society. This bill has too few guidelines to adequately control this new market, its investors, and its producers. This bill shows clearly that this government is making cannabis legalization a political issue and is now doing it too quickly and is pressuring us to adopt an incomplete and unacceptable bill. According to the government, Bill C-45 was supposed to initially meet two objectives: limit organized crime's participation in the sector, and secondly, protect youth from consuming cannabis. When it comes to protecting youth, what I find particularly concerning is that adolescents of 12 to 17 years of age will be allowed to possess or distribute up to 5 grams of dried cannabis, or according to the regulation, 25 grams of fresh cannabis. Very few individuals have demonstrated how sections 8 and 9 will succeed in removing cannabis from the hands of innocent victims. How can any parent accept such reasoning?
Innocent victims? They're victims?
For youth. Is this truly an effective way to restrict access to recreational cannabis, given its devastating effect on health, their studies, and personality?
Allow me to express my doubt about the use of this drug. It's starting as early as age 9 in some cases. I don't normally agree with Michael Spack, but this time he was talking about the lack of cohesiveness of this bill.
Who possess more than 5 grams of marijuana, an activity that would be perfectly legal for adults. Nowhere else in the criminal code is a youth criminalized for an act that is legal for an adult. Autrement dit, si vous êtes un adulte et que vous possédez plus que...
In other words, if you're an adult and you have over 30 grams of dry cannabis, you may get a $200 fine. But if you're a youth of age 12 to 17 and you have over 5 grams, you will be exposed to the Youth Criminal Justice Act.
That is pretty fucked. Yeah, that's pretty fucked.
It is a very incohesive situation where we're seeking to protect children. Young people will be entering the youth criminal justice system, and if that is the case, then they may remain there for a long time. This legislation on cannabis also is raising fears among the scientific community, particularly psychiatrists. My colleague said earlier that this is a scientifically recognized compound that triggers psychosis. We have a number of youth who are in psychosis when they show up at the ER at hospitals and having consumed marijuana. I would like to remind you that the Quebec Association of Psychiatrists is recommending that it should not be used by those under the age of 25. The bill, it would be a compromise if the age were set at age 21, according to Edith Baudry, who is a member of the association. Plausible studies confirm that the brain develops until age 25. According to Dr. Karine Boita, president of the Association of Psychiatrists in Quebec, the studies are clear. The higher the THC, the higher use is, the more the symptoms are there.
The better it is!
Psychiatrists in Quebec have recommended a maximum of 15 to 16% THC content. We need to continue to study in depth the effects of the use of THC on the human brain. The current situation is insufficient, and legalization represents a huge risk of the unknown. If cannabis is legalized without THC limits,
bullshit?
It could reach higher than 30%. We need to find a way to mitigate the dangers to the health of youth who are consuming cannabis. Let's talk about cannabis addiction. Dr. Mondras, a psychobiologist at McLean Hospital, a hospital associated with Harvard, he wrote the following.
Marijuana will be addicted, and those who use it weekly report experiencing bizarre thought, paranoia, and hallucination. Marijuana using adolescents is associated with reduced motivation, poor educational and employment outcomes. For youth aged 12 to 18 in the state of Colorado, past month use of marijuana increased using 20% in 2 years after legalization compared with the 2 years before legalization. Drug-related suspension and expulsion from school increased 40%. La dépendance au cannabis existe.
Cannabis addiction exists. It can have an impact on the life of youth, and also is a financial challenge for parents who have to pay astronomical sums.
Right? The girl's the interpreter, so the guy who's actually speaking
I feel that in this bill, a clause should be written that could guarantee that fines on delinquent producers will be used solely for prevention and to financially support rehab centers. This money would be the least it could do, given the little engagement our government has shown to date on awareness raising. unfortunately, young Aboriginals are also forgotten on this file. The leader of the Abidjois community is concerned about the impact of legalization of marijuana on his community. His concern drew my attention. He said to Radio-Canada on November 22nd, "It's catastrophic for us. There will be higher use and easier access for children. I cannot imagine a scenario like this one. I am angry about the decision by the Government of Canada to have it taken this route."
But that's your feelings. Your feelings can't be involved. It's not that.
Youth,
it's not
like
a bad
all youth, do not deserve to be sacrificed for the greater good of the cannabis industry, and there will be hundreds of thousands of dollars used to their detriment, as said Dr. Stanley Vallant, who was also part of the Aboriginal community. If Aboriginal bands can ban use on their lands, some of them are so close to the city that it will be basically ineffective. Remember that children, your children and grandchildren, are supposed to be at the heart of the current government's concerns. Concerning organized crime, which is the second argument that the government uses for legalization, the Journal de Montréal raised a very worrisome situation. 40% of cannabis producers' money comes from tax havens. Don't forget that the money sent to tax haven largely comes from organized crime, who have been selling illegal drugs in Canada, and yet the bill will not penalize the individuals who are breaking the illicit substances laws. This is a very gray zone for which organized crime will control part of the market, the legal marketing for cannabis. In Section 5.1, there is a $300,000 fine and maximum imprisonment of 2 years, one or the other, if flavors are added to tobacco. However, with C45, an organization that uses youth to sell marijuana will face a maximum fines of $100,000, $300,000 for tobacco, $100,000 for marijuana. It's a double standard, and there's nothing to prevent them to go through the back door of organized crime. The minister is proposing allowing the growth of 4 plants per home, but there is no system to trace, and it will cost millions of dollars. It will be useless to catch individuals who are trafficking marijuana. Worse, if you have 1 or 2 plants too many, the fine will be $200 when the value of this production will be between $1,000 and $2,000. We strongly believe that this will not allow police officers to fight the gray market, marijuana sold in a very subtle fashion illegally. The GE program on TVA looked at dismantling crime networks. The show doubts that organized crime will be affected by the legislation. They don't have to pay tax. They don't have to look at collective agreements, and they're already decreasing their production costs. It will be like contraband cigarettes. I remind you that just in Esprit, 40% of cigarettes smoked by high school students are purchased illegally. 40%.
So I'm just going to open a weed church. Everybody's going to join my church. I'm going to be a pastor. We're not going to pay any tax on all of our sacrament supplies and worshiping supplies and everything else. Weed church.
Provinces will need to decide if they will allow online sale or how they expect retailers to enforce minimum age requirement. Purchasing online and receiving home delivery will create additional problems. As you know, it is pretty easy to lie about your age when you are in front of a computer screen.
Yeah, but you got to sign for that shit.
Le Daily Telegraph de Londres publiait le 1er janvier.
She doesn't know what he's
such
saying.
as Instagram and Snapchat, to sell illegal substances to young people. Experts have warned. Young workers said this prohibiting trend had rapidly accelerated within the last 18 months, with dealers using the platform to target children under 13 years old. Dans l'étude du projet de loi,
in the study of the bill, we need to look at the means organized crime will use to get around the act once it's adopted. There are tools already used by criminals to sell the drugs, and yet the bill contains no measures to address this issue that is constantly on the rise. Already, Canada is behind on organized crime. The Conservatives proposed some things on marijuana, and that included no longer criminalizing civil possession and giving pardons. This would have been more prudent and would have made mothers and fathers safer, who already see this as a scourge on our society.
A scourge?
I have a lot of respect for an individual who's on Radio Canada. They said that
this person smokes weed and you're like, oh, I can't believe I'm translating all this shit.
And then legalization would take more time to try to better legislate this way to manage marijuana in Canada is against the interests of most Canadians. Honourable Senators, I would invite you to demonstrate responsibility and not hesitate to vote against this bill as we should. Unfortunately, after 109 witnesses in the other place, MPs passed only a few amendments. This is important legislation that we are called to being voted upon in this place. And when you study this bill, keep in mind the interests of young people and not the cannabis industry and its lobbyists.
What? The cannabis industry lobbyists?
And the most vulnerable for whom marijuana legalization will...
Got some right to talk.
Put them into an infernal cycle. And they will be fighting for their survival. 30 seconds? 30 seconds. 5 minutes? Would you like an additional 5 minutes? Thank you very much. I will conclude by saying that Canada can and must do better and differently to protect its youth. I will not repeat it again. In Quebec, in ERs, nearly 50% of cases of psychosis are cases of cannabis intoxication, 50%. So I would invite you to caution. Cannabis intoxication, cannabis psychosis can be permanent. I will tell you the story of a doctor friend who's around my age. He at age 34, he finished his study and he has no hope of developing full abilities. Marijuana is a drug. Marijuana is not a cigarette. It is 10 times as powerful now than it was. And so I invite you on behalf of the children of Canada to be very careful and to take our time to ensure that there are no more victims than there are today. Thank you.
Bullshit.
Senator Smith, on debate.
Let me tell you, I bought Monopoly Canada Edition.
Honourable Senators,
and the Monopoly Canada Edition puts Newfoundland as the 2 lowest properties.
Since the bill was passed in the other place, we have heard significant concerns from many of our colleagues of all parties and groups here in the Senate, representing all corners of the country. And, fairly stated, they reflect the wide range of opinions held by Canadians. I think this has been a good and worthy exchange, as what we have heard will inform the work that remains before us and demonstrates the seriousness this matter requires. It is my goal today to be faithful to my role as senator in this chamber, as a member of the official opposition, and to my obligation as leader of the opposition. At its core, this means our work must strive to ensure that all views, contrary to those of the government, be fully voiced and considered. We must be a voice for those Canadians who have significant and valid concerns about the policy choice their government is making. Comme j'ai souligné au début de mes remarques à la réunion de committee,
as I said at the beginning of my comments at the meeting of the Committee of the Whole on February 6th, Conservative senators will study Bill C-45 seriously and with the attention it deserves.
5 areas of particular concern to Canadians and cite general elements where the government appears to be less than fulsome in its consideration of matters arising from their policy choices. Policy choices that they themselves advance as being in the interest of public safety and driven by a central commitment to harm reduction. Public safety and harm reduction is their standard, and the Senate is here to determine if that standard is met, and if found otherwise, advise and amend the legislation accordingly. Firstly, children and youth. As I've listened to my colleagues, I conclude that one of the more commonly held concerns deals with the impact that the government's policy approach, including legalization, will have on the health and well-being of our children and youth. Over the past few weeks, senators have received hundreds of letters and emails from concerned Canadians who wonder why the government is, in their view, putting the health and safety of our children at risk with this legislation. En conséquence, il nous sera utile de mettre en place des critères d'intérêt.
As a result, it would be useful to establish public interest criteria applicable to the government's choices to determine whether it's protecting our children and youth as it claims.
Attention to children living in homes where once this bill is passed, absent fear of significant legal penalties, there is likely to be increased direct and indirect exposure to cannabis. Whether it is consumption or homegrown plants, children are not afforded any protection from adults legally smoking up and growing plants. Some may be likely to suggest that people smoke and grow now prior to the introduction of this bill. I'm certain that this is true, but they do so facing legal consequences that will be overturned if this bill is made law in its current form. So I share the concern that, having made great efforts over many decades to protect Canadians, particularly children, from the unwanted impacts of secondhand tobacco smoke, we ought to make extra efforts to not set back all of that progress by legalization without adequate protection. The argument that the provinces will put in place rules for protection persists in our discussion. As of today, however, this remains unclear. Preparations to sell the product has taken place. However, they are unprepared to protect to people who will be impacted and without any protection, not now and maybe not for a long time, perhaps never. This issue needs to be addressed. With regard to youth, health professionals have told us that the brain continues to develop until the age of 25. Yet, this legislation sets the legal age limit at consumption for 18. The Canadian Medical Association has stated the following, and I quote, we still want to set the age of 21 and maybe 25
develop,
because the damage done to the brain will be permanent. End of quote.
That's your choice.
Si le cerveau se développe jusqu'à l'âge de 25 ans, alors que...
If the brain develops until the age of 25, well, it might be a good idea to follow the opinion of the Canadian Medical Association, which wishes to increase the age of cannabis consumption to protect the youth, the brains of thousands of young people.
Shifting the focus, we have also heard concerns on the government's efforts aimed at prevention, education, and protection of health and well-being. If legalization brings greater exposure and signals normalizing social acceptance, it then demands a corresponding harm reduction and public safety effort. We have seen responses from other jurisdictions that lead me to believe that the implementation of legalization so far is too advanced in comparison to prevention and education efforts. In other words, lots of words, but not enough execution. At the Committee of the Whole last month, the Minister of Health mentioned the government is investing $46 million in public education and that the national program should be launched in March. I have yet to see this key national public education advertising campaign, nor any indication that we will in the near future. I did send a letter this week to the Minister of Health asking her that question, because I did ask it at the Committee of the Whole. Le ministère de Santé a dit en comité.
The Minister of Health said in Committee of the Whole, and I quote, "We've obtained a lot of information from our counterparts in Colorado. They told us that if they had to start the exercise from the beginning again, they would certainly ensure that they had an awareness-raising campaign for the general public established before the legalization of the substance."
To do it over again, we put more money and have a bigger program. Well, Minister Petit-Pas-Taylor said that this is exactly what is being done. I would argue that this is not the case. We are not ensuring that public awareness is in place before the product is legalized. How can it be in place when the National Education Campaign has yet to launch, even though we are a mere few weeks away from legalization? Dr. Mark Ware, co-chair of Ottawa's Marijuana Task Force,
because we don't know anything about weed yet, apparently.
And I quote, "Canada should immediately boost spending on intensive public education and research into the impacts of marijuana and not wait until 2018. End of quote. Fellow senators, please allow me to take time to look at the educational timeline, as I find it very troublesome. It is a known fact that youth will better receive information from trusted mentors, such as teachers, coaches, and parents. It appears that the educational program targeting youth will not be prepared in time for this year's school cycle. Well, when does school end? School ends in June. Well, if it doesn't start, the training doesn't start before June, what happens during the summer? The kids play and fall asleep, and we all fall asleep during summer vacations. So this means that
we all fall asleep during summer vacations.
The implications and dangers of consuming marijuana in schools prior to its legalization. The lack of planning by the government on the educational campaign is deeply concerning. While the recent budget announced funding amounting to $18 million, that's on top of the 46 in the next fiscal year, and Senator Petit-Claire was very clear in her definition of the percentage of dollars spent in Canada. It'll be much less. It will only kick in after marijuana legalization. It would seem to me that the Minister of Health is not taking the lessons learned from Colorado to heart, nor the advice from her own task force. If she were, we would have had a national program launched and underway months, if not years ago. The Liberal Party included marijuana legislation as a central point in their election platform. The groundwork on educating the public, and especially our youth, should have begun as soon as the current government
keep shooting
took
it down.
office. But
or else people would do it.
And in their neglect to do so, the government commitment to harm reduction approach must be called into question. Public safety. Public safety is another area of common concern. Whether it is the government's decision to focus first on the legalization of smoking products, products that are banned in some jurisdiction where other forms are accepted, or the absence of THC regulations, there is ample cause for concern. Selon la Fédération des médecins spécialistes du Québec.
According to the Quebec Federation of Medical Specialists, the THC rate in the marijuana consumed today is much higher, and that can lead to an increased addiction risk among consumers. Why doesn't this bill address the THC limits in order to protect the brain development of future generations?
See, regulation now.
Buddy in the government worried about fucking brain development. Probably part of the Illuminati or some shit anyway.
Concentrates in marijuana-infused products, as we have seen in the case of Colorado. Honorable Senators, would it not have been prudent to learn from Colorado's experience and set clear potency limits now? Perhaps, for that matter, legalize and strictly regulate these forms while maintaining a ban on smoking marijuana? In this case, we have only a commitment to introduce regulations on edibles and extractives at some ambiguous later date. It seems a step backwards, or at least a misplaced sense of priority. A rigorous and comprehensive regulatory framework for public safety that enables this bill is clearly needed. The government, having chosen not to follow the normal regulatory development process and cutting corners along the way, will only present the final regulations after the bill becomes law. And I do refer back to question period this week when I asked Minister Bryson, why are you not putting this into the pre-period? He didn't answer the question. It was the most interesting answer I've ever heard. I couldn't understand a goddamn word that was said. Excuse my language. It's unparliamentary, and I realize that, but at the same time, we are citizens of Canada. We're fighting for citizens of Canada. It will not, in a public and transparent manner, and following their own rules, pre-publish and consult on the final form of regulations. This, to many of us, is an alarming approach.
I couldn't understand a goddamn word. What the fuck was that?
Where is the harm reduction and cutting corners from regulations? Enforcement. I would like to speak to the black market, traffic, and marijuana. I will reiterate what several of my colleagues and RCMP witnesses at committee have already stated. This legislation will not eliminate the black market as this government so adamantly claims it will. With the delay in bringing edibles into the fold and leaving other marijuana-infused products outside of the legal framework, this bill will ensure that black market continues. Home and outdoor grow will also fuel the black market, especially since the height restriction on plants in homes was removed. My goodness, those plants are growing. As my colleague Senator Vern White has said, the only way someone under 18 years of age can buy marijuana under this legislation is illegal, both in activity and in product. Imagine looking out across a classroom of 12 to 13-year-old children, all permitted to have 5 grams of pot on their desks. I share the concern that this legislation. Why have we left it to the provinces and territories to prohibit youth possession? When we can demonstrate
the schools can say no marijuana on site.
Why youth under 18 can possess up to 5 grams of dried cannabis without offense in this legislation. It is a criminal offense to sell or give marijuana to youth under the age of 18. I have not heard much from the government other than leaving it up to the province and territories about what strategies have been examined to minimize the likelihood that youth will be able to access the black market.
Furthermore, we know that foreign tax havens help finance Canadian marijuana companies. In recent weeks, a number of members of the media in Quebec revealed that nearly half of the 86 companies receiving a permit from Health Canada to grow marijuana are funded through tax havens, often used by organized crime to launder money.
The government mused aloud about the changes they intend to make. I thought they had all of this thought through. This is clearly not the case. This brings me to how this legislation will introduce new judicial burdens, despite claims from the government that the legislation will lessen them. Throughout the study of Bill C-46 at the Standing Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs, experts have repeatedly stated that this legislation is ahead of the science. There is currently no government-approved roadside testing technology for marijuana impairment. So what does that mean for the officers who are supposed to implement this on the streets? The committee has also heard from witnesses that there will be constitutional challenges by people who are facing the consequences of having a criminal record for drug offenses without scientific certainty. This is the opposite impact of what the government is intending. Indigenous impact.
Of course you don't want any fucking
The Minister of Health highlighted that she has heard from our Indigenous communities that they also want to ensure that the programs are going to be currently sensitive and meet their needs. We have heard assurances that the consultations have been held that meet the legal and constitutional obligations given to our special relationship with Canada's First Nations people. I have examined the record and have come to the view that what has been done and what the government plans to do fall well short of the mark. What I hear leaves me unconvinced as to the government's intentions. I'm especially concerned with the impact on the health for Indigenous people in Canada. Over the last month, Senator Patterson has spent hours traveling and discussing this legislation with elders, leaders, and concerned citizens all over the far north. And the response has been clear. Communities are not prepared to implement this legislation as they are not receiving the necessary supports for addiction and mental health treatment. Malheureusement, au Canada, le suicide, c'est les jeunes.
Unfortunately, the suicide rate among First Nations youth aged 15 to 24 is 5 to 6 times higher than the rate among non-Aboriginal people
Ontario.
in communities where depression and suicide are already all too common. I fear that this bill is not making the necessary efforts to help Aboriginal populations.
5 minutes to make a speech, hopefully, that makes some sense. Honorable Senators, we know that there are many outstanding concerns, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today.
He's going to end
the bill's goal to protect youth in its current form is failing. The failure, and this failure, will be at the expense of irreparable damage to children and youth, in particular, society in general. Comme les sénateurs, nous devons accorder la priorité à...
As senators, we must give priority to the health and safety of Canadians. According to the data that we've seen up to now, without considering the unintended consequences that we've seen elsewhere, it is clear that this bill does raise very serious concerns.
Steamroll ahead, refusing to listen to the recommendation of medical experts, law enforcement experts, and even other jurisdictions that have legalized marijuana. It is up to the Senate to demonstrate that there needs to be greater regard for the consequences, a greater attention paid to managing the risks and concerns that have been identified, and serious action on public education. Fellow Senators, as members of the upper chamber, let us be faithful to our role as sober second thought and collectively make valuable contributions in the best interest of all Canadians. This is what Canadians expect us to do. If the key issues I've raised are not addressed, this bill will in fact not protect Canadians. And we will have failed Canadians. Et n'oublions pas que notre cause commune est fondée.
And let us not forget that our common cause is based on the difference that we can and should make by uniting our efforts to protect Canadian families and communities as we continue to study this bill.
Senator Lang, a question? Senator Smith, you take.
Thank you very much. I have a couple questions, but I want to begin seeking clarification. I agree with a lot of the concerns that you've raised, by the way. I did, however, hear you say that the law would prohibit, would permit a group of young people to have 5 grams of pot. I'm not disputing what you say on their desk, that's not the issue, but that it would permit them. I didn't understand the bill that way. I'm wondering now, because Senator Bobineau said the same thing, am I misunderstanding something? Is that accurate, what you said to us?
Senator Smith.
Senators, make sure that I'll take your question under advisement, and I'll double check it. Just from the information that I'd received is that there would be an availability of children 12 to 17 to be able to have actual marijuana in their hands. Excuse me? No, I'm not being critical. I just, did you have something to add? So my understanding is some of the provinces are stepping up to disallow children to have some of these, or young people to have some of these options. And the point in here was, well, let's make sure that if there's any confusion or conflict between the provinces and the federal body, let's get the federal body to take the initiative. Let's not push on the provinces what can be done at a federal level. What leadership should we be taking? Because it's easy to pass it on to someone else. And I have to tell you, in life, in my short life, which is getting longer, hopefully, is that it really bothers me when people in authority pass the buck to someone else and say, you do it. Because it's not for them to do it, it's for us to do it.
Senator Lang.
Thank you. My understanding is that it doesn't permit them. In fact, it still is not permissible. But if they are found to have that amount, they would be treated under a juvenile system, or provincial offenses system, and that they won't be criminalized. They won't have a record that will follow them, and they won't go to jail at that age group. That's my understanding. You said something different. I just wanted to make sure that we're talking on the same facts. The other thing that I find, difficult in exercising judgment, it's our job, but the conflict in views that come forward from professional organizations. So again, you and Senator Boivin referred, I believe, to the CNA and their view that the age limit should be higher, and I think he said a compromise of 21, you said 21 to 25. I just wondering if you're aware, I was reading just this morning from a blog from the Canadian Association of Pediatric Centers and the pediatric chairs of universities who were here on the Hill giving a presentation, a panel presentation in sponsorship by Senator O. And they said with respect to age, and these are two very credible medical organizations dealing with youth, they said that the consensus was that age 18, or the same age as alcohol, because in some provinces it's 19, was preferable from a harm reduction point of view. And I think that means being able to get in and do something, with people, understanding that they're probably going to smoke, let's get it regulated, quality controlled, and all of that. That is not disputing the effect on the brain. It's saying a better way to be able to deal with it is through a harm reduction approach. I just wondered if you could comment on that with respect to the age preference.
People that you saw who were doctors, and each doctor was pretty consistent in saying that it should be more than 18 years old. It should be between either 21 to 25 because of the impact of development on the brain. And then, of course, people say publicly, well, because of the liquor laws, we need to put it at 18 or 19. I understand that argument. I guess the point that frustrates me is let's look at other elements, and some of us in our families have it, where we have people, grandmothers, aunts, and uncles who were alcoholics and pass that gene on to their children. And then grandchildren now are alcoholics. And the biggest growth with that type of addiction issue is with young girls 18 to 35 years old. I have a couple of my friends whose daughters are 35 years old who are binge drinkers. If you've never seen someone who becomes addicted by being a binge drinker, I mean, I cry every time I see these people because they've been gone for treatment now for over 2 years. Their families have spent over $200,000 just to get them through. So the issue of age and doctors, when I hear 5 doctors say consistently the same thing, whether it's 21 or 25, what they're saying is the range that we should have is between 21 and 25. The issue is who has the political courage to try to implement that because of the factors that we say, well, kids are getting booze at 18 and 19. Well, God, I got beer when I was 13. We used to give somebody $5 and they would buy us 2 beers. We'd have 2 beers and smoke a cigarette, and then we'd go home and my parents would say, have you had anything to drink? But guess what we learned? We learned that if you do it too often, you're not going to feel good. And we were lucky. I didn't have in my family anyone who had any alcoholic tendencies. So I learned the hard way. So is that the same thing that will happen with marijuana? But more importantly, if we have scientific evidence that brain development is affected 21 to 25, then I think we should listen to that. It is important that we listen to that, as opposed to say, oh no, well, because we can get booze at 18 and 19, let's leave it at 18 or 19. I'm not sure it's the right thing to do.
Senator Lycan? One last question, and again, I think the point you raised is something that we should explore very seriously at committee. I will just let you know that the blog from these 2 organizations refers to that meeting and says that one of the recommendations panelists talked about around minimum age, that the consensus that alignment with legal age of alcohol consumption was most desirable from a harm reduction perspective. So I don't know how it went from the meeting to this, but I think this issue of harm reduction and where it fits in and to what degree is important for us to explore, because I've seen in terms of treatment of alcoholism, the same thing, harm reduction approach. The last question I want to ask you then is, I appreciate your commitment that people are going to be digging into these issues at committee, and
I likewise want to do that, and I just want to ask you, does that mean that you'll vote in principle in favor of this bill to get it to committee?
Because
he's going to turn it down.
I have been very direct. I have a great relationship with the leader of the government because I respect him. I know he's got a tough job to do, and I think hopefully he has some respect for what we're trying to do. And I'll put it on the table right now, is that we talked about it, about that particular subject. Many of us have very strong feelings about this legislation, and if I could summarize, it's quite simple.
She asked you a question. Say yes or no.
There are a lot of holes in this legislation, so you have two choices in your mindset: is do you do more to try to make it acceptable or better, or do you make a decision?
Why are you explaining your principles? Are you voting yay or nay? She asked you a question.
The opposition's job is to really look at legislation, and if you don't agree with it, you oppose it.
I understand Robert's Rules of Orders. I was a president in Toastmasters Club, so I understand this shit.
Asking me if I vote for it, I would just say that what's most important is for the government and the people that believe in the government's direction to vote very strongly with their hearts in favor of doing this, if this is what you want to do.
That's not what she asked.
This is what the obligation of the government leader is to the people on the other side and this side of the table. Okay? Our role is to make sure we do understand what we're talking about and make sure that we have talked about it amongst ourselves and come to a consensus. We have a tremendous group with a tremendous discipline and a tremendous respect for our kids in Canada. And so, asking me if I'm going to vote for it, we've already decided amongst ourselves largely do what we think is right, and I think I'll do what is right when we come to that point today. But I would encourage you folks to do what you think is right.
So she's not saying if he is or he isn't.
This is a government piece of legislation that the government puts forward.
That's right.
And it's not for us to make that decision.
But she asked you if you were...
I saw a number of senators rising. First, Senator Brain. I saw Senator Omidyar. Do you have a question, Senator Omidyar?
Thank you, Chair. My questions have been asked and answered. I won't take up the Honourable Senator's time.
Ms. Monsignor?
I have a question for Senator Smith, if he agrees. It's about what you just said regarding your group. What I wanted to say, I don't know if you listened to the speeches made by the senators on this side of the House. We're not in opposition, and we're not for the government either. Many comments were made regarding the fact that there are concerns in the way the legislation is currently presented. And all of the senators who spoke have raised their concerns. And what we want is for all these concerns, the aged packaging, comestibles, edibles rather, we want all of that to be studied in committee. So, you seem to be saying that you do not want this bill to be studied in committee. How do you want this bill to be analyzed in a more in-depth fashion with witnesses if we don't send it to committee? I did not suggest anything.
Oh, they're going to argue
What
through
I
an
suggested
interpreter.
is that the government's obligation is to promote and support the police and government laws. Our role as opposition is to criticize and analyze, and like Mr. Harder, I stated that or who I really respect, I said that we're going to evaluate this and we're going to play our role.
There's been one person watching my show this whole time. Who is it? Who are you? I'm putting your name down for an extra ballot. Who is this one person watching right now?
I don't think something is a good idea. It doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that it's your obligation as a group.
Extra ballot for
As a
this one
parliamentary
person
group.
watching right now. to win this package on April Fool's Day?
Because we are going to make our own choice
Who are you?
about
Say
what
here.
we're going to do ourselves. That's what I wanted to say. Senator Monsieur, just a clarification. When you say
Rosie Hatch.
our group, each senator who is an independent senator makes his or her own decision, and these are not group decisions. Whatever you
Oh,
might think
Evelyn's
about
here.
that.
Well, it says one. All right, we'll put Evelyn
But the
down
question
too.
is, to what extent are we going to be able to move this bill forward, in your opinion? That's the challenge of how the Prime Minister structured your group, which is that on some points you need to take decisions. Yes, you're independent, but as a group, there is a track record of voting patterns.
So basically, what it is we're
And I
going through a
think
bunch
that
of,
shows what's really going on.
bullshit.
And I don't want to have a conflict because I respect you. You are very competent in all of your fields of action. But we are very proud of our way of doing things when it comes to how we handle the Westminster
Would be a
system.
really good time to have more
We are not
cannabis.
consultants. We are a group that takes
To
decisions.
blaze more cannabis.
And we only make decisions
Well,
after a healthy discussion between ourselves.
Senator, take another question.
I'm ready for a nap. Go ahead. Yes.
I'm ready for a nap. Yeah, let's vote.
Because
you're going to say no anyways, you
as an
motherfuckers.
independent senator, we all are independent senators. The only way you could be dismissed from this chamber is to be convicted of a crime, an indictable crime. But we are independent, and I pride myself on my independence. And as an independent, conservative-thinking senator, I have a question for you, and that is because you have a lot of experience in business. I understand that when a product is a legal product for sale in our country, that comes with it, I think according to our Constitution, the freedom of speech, the right to market and promote that product. And my understanding also is that most businesses work by a bottom line where the whole idea of a business is to make money, and it's basically to sell a product at a profit and increase your market share and drive value to the shareholders, even if they're in an offshore country. But so I don't understand how, if we are going to go from a product that is not legal for sale to one that is legal for sale, do you think there's any possibility that there will be less of that product sold?
Senator Smith.
Well, if you're talking, there's two factors of what will the legal market be for marijuana. If you look at the Canopy, and the president of Canopy was, after the first visit that Senator Dean set up, was very eloquent when he started talking about his market cap and the expected market cap as his business was going to grow. As a legal producer, this market will grow significantly. Is the number, it's presently the illegal market in Canada, if I understand correctly, is about $7 billion a year. So the legal market will be a multiple of that market, right? So
It still says
there's
one.
two elements. There's the legal sales and the increase of market cap, and secondly, in the
Oh my
illegal
God.
market, will that legal market
Cannabis-
continue?
Cannabis Corner
My
isn't going
sense is,
anywhere
and
until
I
this is
don't have
over.
Statistics
I'll give
in front of
fuck.
me, but I would guess that that illegal market will continue. And will it thrive? I would suggest to you it will thrive, and possibly it may thrive on people who are underage acquiring that product. And so this, again, we have to look at what we're doing to see how this whole project is going to advance with the legal market and the illegal market. And don't forget the people that have invested into the companies, 80, what is it? Half of the 86 companies that have investment is from offshore money, and offshore money comes through in many situations, not only the wealthy people in our country and other countries, but through organized crime. So there's all sorts of issues that are direct and indirect that affect legal sales and potentially illegal sales.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I understand correctly the Leader of the Opposition's position, when he says that the federal government should not pass the buck for 5 grams and less for youth, what that means is that the federal government should throw the criminal code with its full weight for young people who have 5 grams and less. Well, that's what this means. Well, that's what the bill says, only says that for 5 grams and less, the federal government would not sanction with a crime young people. That's all that what the bill says, and therefore what the provinces can do and have done is say that the provincial law would apply for those young people. So are you in favor of having crimes for young people 12 to 17 for 5 grams or less? Are you in favor of that?
Senator Smith.
So if you could just repeat your question, because there was quite a little noise. Just the last 2 seconds, Senator Pratt, would be helpful.
Of young people 12 to 17, 5 grams or less of marijuana being charged with a crime.
Of course, I think part of the motivation that you bring the question up with is your perception of past governments and some of the tough on crime issues that were brought up. What I would suggest, because it is a question that is important, is that we thoroughly think through some of the issues that may be nebulous or gray areas with this new legislation with young people.
Unless I don't find any weed.
Obviously, there has been a move over time to try to make sure that we don't penalize young people unfairly. So I wouldn't appreciate having words trying to be put in my mouth as to whether I think criminalization and increasing criminal penalties is the answer. I think the real answer is making sure that whatever we do with implementing the policies surrounding legalization, we think through and we utilize every element possible to make sure that we have fairness. And one thing you haven't asked me any questions on, which is something that bothers me, because on the Finance Committee, is that when we dealt with Indigenous, the community, is that the Indigenous community, to me, is not being served, just from what I hear from Senator Patterson, in that these poor folks are in remote areas with no infrastructure, with no support structure, with a very not a strong police force, and have to use RCMP and outside people.
He was going to say a very weak police force.
That these people who are potentially the most threatened people are going to be taking care of the young people. Because we saw those young kids come in here and saw the pride in their eyes when they're standing up. But think about the kids that are out in the boondocks that don't have that opportunity that those kids had that we had up here. We have to start to take action and stop talking and get the damn things done so that we can have results. We need to have results, but it has to be action. Most of our
action won't happen if today happens. If people vote no, action won't happen.
And look at the track record, Senator Pratt. 2.5 years, lots of promises, no results. My life has always been one thing: don't make more promises that you can. Don't talk about promises, talk about results. And in my life, it's helped me, and hopefully for us as a group, we can find some ways to make sure, and I think our group does a great job, everybody involved, but let's focus on what we need to do to get results.
But he's on the vape again in the background.
I'm not questioning your record, because respect, you know that. My only question was, since the bill regarding youth and possession of 5 grams and less of cannabis, all the bill does is say that it would not be a crime to possess 5 grams or less for these youth. Therefore, by suggesting that the federal government should do something for these young people, do something, what is it that you suggest the federal government should do?
Make sure that any confusion that could exist with the drug and with children, or sorry, young people between certain age, let's make sure we clarify it and we set up the best possible situation or rule so that there isn't people falling into traps that could be really harmful to them and their future. That's what I'm really saying. If there's any confusion, let's identify it, let's fix the problem, and let's stop talking about, you know, all the potential things that could happen. Let's fix the problem now. Let's do it now. And that's the problem that many of us have with this legislation. Too many holes.
Senator Reid.
Leader, are you aware, and I'm going to follow on Senator Pratt's question about the 5 grams that are allowed to a person of 18 and younger, Are you aware, and I've asked this question at Legal and Constitutional, and they do admit, yes, somebody could have 5 joints, 6 joints in their pocket. And Senator Pratt saying, well, you don't want to put the full force of the law, but are you aware
Just
that
refresh your browser or something, I don't know.
have 0 tolerance for anybody under 18, and we could also use decriminalize, so anybody caught with 5 grams or less could be a finable offense and decriminalize that little section. But they just, I found, and perhaps you have read the bill differently, I found them to be unaware, unthought through. And also, have you thought about, if I'm 17, where am I going to buy it? Because I can't buy it legally. So where am I going to get it?
Well, Senator Eaton, I had the opportunity of speaking to l'Association des Parents du Québec and Canada, and it was fascinating. Just 2 points that I might think you might find interesting. The ladies that I spoke with, who were the heads, said the vast majority of parents that they speak with are not up to speed, not aware of what's going on. Because one of the elements that they want to protect children, young children, is they don't want any pot sold within 1 kilometer of the schools and the school zones.
That's now.
I just asked a simple question. I said, how will you prevent that without having enforcement nearby to make sure? And they said, well, the SAQ people told us that we won't set up within 1 kilometer of your facility. I said, well, I'm not sure that any of these kids who are in primary school or secondary school are going to go to an SAQ to buy it. But there seems to be a bit of a lack of understanding of what parameters could exist. My only point, and I said it to Senator Pratt without trying to be obnoxious, is that if there are holes or problems and we can get things done up front, I just think it makes it better to do things in front of the action as opposed to behind the action. Because what happens when things aren't done up front, and I know I'm realistic, even in business we had similar issues. You look back and do an audit, a post-mortem on a project, you say, yeah, we could have done this better, we could have done this better, but what if there's 5 or 6 things that we can do better right now? Let's do it now.
Rolling bar.
So he's saying,
I do have a question now, Senator Smith. I will take up a little bit more of your time. I think some of the issues you raised are issues I'm concerned about, many of us are concerned about: age limits, potency levels, interaction with other substances.
Right?
But
or a preschool, or a fucking daycare, or you have a liquor store right there. It doesn't matter.
These questions are in committee, where we hear from witnesses, where we hear from stakeholders, and we hear from experts. And in fact, you were part of the arrangement that sent the bill already to Aboriginal Affairs, to Legal, to Foreign Affairs, and maybe some others I'm not remembering. So I'm a little confused by the yin and yang here. You've sent this here, but you're blocking it here. You're posing questions. We know we can get... Well, you have said that you will be voting against sending it to committee. I heard that. So perhaps you could clarify that for me, that the confusion in my mind, if you want answers to these questions, very sensible, important questions, isn't committee the right place to do it?
Sir, I have the greatest respect for you, and I met you very early in your entrance into the Senate. Honestly, I don't remember saying anything to the fact that I was voting against sending this to committee. What I did say was, in my discussions with the leader of the government representative, I suggested that we're not the ones who have to get your work done for you. What we're trying to do is be no, but seriously, because people are saying we're going to block this. Well, what we're saying is we're looking at this. We've done a lot of study. Whatever decision we come up with, we have independent people who can do what they want, because we'll ask them, what should we do? And so when we ask our folks, what should we do? And our folks tell us, we listen because we have that discipline within our group because we work together to come to a conclusion. But I never said what we were going to do. What I did say, and I said it to the media, because I'm tired of people saying, you know, you're trying to block this and wait a sec. What we're trying to do is our job. But what happens if we feel that there are enough significant issues involved that we may not want to support something? Are we being the obstructionist people? No. What it is if the government has a program and a plan, it's up to the government to get its plan through. We haven't changed. We haven't changed this great group of people yet to be a bunch of consultants. Okay? And I don't have a problem with consultants. What I do have a problem with is people who feel they're in a position where there has to be some form of coordination and teamwork to get to a conclusion with whatever you do. We've got that. This is what I think you folks are trying to strive to create. You have Senator Wu, Senator Saint-Germain. Okay, well, if it's not that, that's whatever you want to have is what you're going to have. I'm just telling you what we have. So please do not tell us that we're being obstructionists and we're not doing our job. We are doing our job. We've worked very hard. Claude Carignan has worked very hard. He's got 800 articles. He's been doing research. He's been explaining as our critic what we're going to do. We have a strategy amongst our leadership group. We have everybody involved. We have social media people that are doing a great job. But hey, guys, don't try and say to us, we're the ones that are blocking things. You're the ones that have to get it done. And Senator Harder and myself understand that. Well, Senator Lankin, I have the greatest respect for you. You and I sat together and talked. I'm not pointing at anybody. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I should have cut my hand off. It's just that I went for a pass and I did a move, but no, I'm not. But I think it comes to the point where it's up to you folks to make your own choice. And we'll make our choice too, because we have the right to make our choice.
Let's make the choice. Oh, fuck. She's getting close.
On debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Senators, we are on the brink of voting on Bill C-45, a bill to legalize cannabis use at second reading. First of all, I would like to say that as soon as this election commitment was made in June 2015 and announced by the Prime Minister, my first reaction was one of surprise. Why? How is it that cannabis legalization became a priority for our society? And above all, why is the solution to back down in the face of this problem? Why is that the solution? I've always believed in the decriminalization of simple possession, and I've wanted to avoid having youth being stigmatized with a criminal record for a minor offense. I still believe in this today, when our knowledge of this subject is refining increasingly since the beginning of our debates, but the government wants to go further and become the first country in the world to legalize the free sale of cannabis, even by trying to demonstrate the greatest openness possible. This desire to legalize things so quickly concerns me a great deal in a number of ways. I will try to share the issues raised by Bill C-45 objectively and practically. By legalizing cannabis use in the hurried way proposed without scientific assessment and against all the advice of medical experts, the government is flouting a basic standard of a public modern decision maker, the principle of precaution of healthy public administration. Internationally admitted, this principle was even constitutionalized in 2015 by France as a non-starter for any piece of legislation. The principle of precaution designates a situation in which knowledge is insufficient to scientifically establish the existence of a risk of great harm due to a human activity susceptible to affect the environment, public health, or food security. Here, the human activity in question is the use of cannabis, a product that is consumed
What's up, Cody?
by humans.
Welcome back, Ether. We're just listening to the bullshit government
Canada
talk about cannabis and ready to vote
and was
on its future.
Incorporated into the Consumer Safety Act. This bill, C-45, will profoundly change our society. And the speed at which it is being conducted is troubling. And when we say speed, we also mean improvisation. The Minister of Health tells us that the act will be implemented 8 to 12 weeks after royal assent is given to Bill C-45. To compare, in the American states that legalize cannabis use, a legalization that was decided upon by referendum, I should mention, it was 12 to 24 months after the bill was passed that it came into effect.
Federal.
Colorado passed its
federal
act to legalize cannabis use on December 10th, 2012, and sales started 12 months later on January 1st, 2014 in Washington State. The law was passed on December 5th, 2012, and sales started only 18 months later, namely July 8th, 2014. And finally, in California, the law was passed November 9th, 2016, and sales started 13 months later on January 1st, 2018. And Uruguay took 4 years of preparation before making cannabis accessible through a network of pharmacies.
Uruguay, didn't they?
In this way, local police and health administrations had much more time to prepare, without mentioning the fact that they already had 10 to 15 years of experience in random drug testing among public transporters and drivers and high-risk workers like airline pilots, train engineers, bus drivers, and so on and so forth. Despite all this, the representatives of these American states told us that when the bill's entry into effect occurred, they realized that they really hadn't prepared enough. And now, and we, a country 37 times as large as Colorado, are doing this in 8 weeks. Are we really serious? We have heard from the governments of the provinces, police forces, C-45. I must admit that it has a certain instructive effect by triggering a national dialogue on cannabis. For example, we know that a growing number of Canadians believe that people should not have a criminal record for possession of a small amount of cannabis. Furthermore, some objectives of Bill C-45 are laudable.
Anything legal won't happen.
There seems even to be a consensus on them. It is always useful to highlight that what both parties have in common, and I'll cite 3 things. The following statements made by the Department of Justice at second reading reflect the intentions of Bill C-45. 1. To protect the health of youth by limiting their access to cannabis.
This shit again.
2. To lighten the burden on the criminal justice system. 3, to raise the public about the risks associated, the health risks associated with cannabis use. End of quote. What is fascinating is that despite the universal agreement on these 3 intentions, there are also positions between them for the for, the against, and the maybes, but only on this condition. Why? The answer is simple, and it seems to be in the execution of these 3 good intentions. In other words, how can Bill C-45 reach its objectives, and is legalization the only option for reaching the government's objectives?
A piece of good news is the fact that the primary reason for proposing Bill C-45 no longer exists. We now know, thanks to the December 2017 report by Statistics Canada and the 2017 UN drug report, Canada does not have the highest cannabis use in the world, in particular amongst youth. This is very encouraging In fact, according to StatCan, between 2002 and 2012, the percentage of 15 and 17 years old reporting past year use declined, and usage amounts 18 and 25 remain unchanged. This was also confirmed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer report on the fiscal consideration regarding cannabis. It's just historical data from the Youth Smoking Survey.
All he knows.
Consistent
he knows. All he knows.
In reported youth cannabis consumption in recent years.
To prepare Bill C-45, the government struck a working group which published a report in December 2016.
First, I think this 90-page report is helpful, even if it wasn't objective. But this was no fault of the task force, since members were only fulfilling their objectives as mandated by the government. Now it is a thorough report when compared to the 800-page 2002 Senate report and the 1,000-page Obledin Commission. In fact, the task force report is not even scholarly. For instance, an example of a scholarly government report is the 2015 paper titled Alcohol Consumption in Canada by the Chief Public Health Officer, who at the time was Dr. Gregory Taylor. This study is a half size of the task force report, and yet he has 705 citations. Whereas the task force report has 0, with no bibliography. The reason this matters is because the task force report was used to draft Bill C-45. If the task force report lacks of credibility, then we need to consider it if it's also true for the bill itself. Because as the Minister of Justice said to the Committee of the Whole, and I quote, the government was informed in large part by the advice it received from the task force. Revenons au groupe de travail.
Let's get back to the working group. To its credit, the report recognizes the gaps in our current knowledge on cannabis and the effects of cannabis on human health and development. They recognized that the cannabis policy in its many dimensions had not been the subject of exhaustive and high-quality research in a number of fields. On the many subjects, it noted that the proof was often non-existent, incomplete, or inconclusive.
Here and ask you, what would happen if a pharmacological company said the same things to the Canadian Health Products and Food Branch, the governing body that reviews drug application? Just imagine a pharmacological company presenting its new drug to the FDA and then conclude by saying, even though the evidence for the efficacy of this new drug is non-existent, incomplete, and even inconclusive. We would like the FDA to approve sales of our drug across Canada without a required prescription, and for convenience, allow people to buy it online. Perhaps a member of the FDA will simply smile and say, you are aware that you cannot even buy codeine cough syrup without a prescription. Come back to us once you have performed clinical trials.
So they're saying there's been no clinical studies.
You may be asking
done on
yourself right
cannabis.
now, why then did Health Canada approve cannabis? The short answer is, they did it. In a document titled Information for Healthcare Professionals regarding cannabis use, which contained 1,000 citations, The document begins with a disclaimer in bold print. Cannabis is not an approved therapeutic product, and the provision of this information should not be interpreted as an endorsement of the use of this product or cannabis generally by Health Canada. Fin de la citation. Here is something else that was not mentioned in the House but was addressed by the task force. The member acknowledged that, and I quote, "It is more appropriate to refer to our recommendation as evidence-informed rather than evidence-based." And yet, the Minister of Justice introduced the bill by stating, "Our government understands the complexity of the legalization of cannabis. That is why we have taken a cautious, evidence-based approach." But clearly, the task force advised the government not to use the expression evidence-based. Again, in the same speech, she reiterated the fact that our government believes in evidence-based policy. And then, in a response to a question, she said, and I quote, "C-45 is an evidence-based piece of legislation that seeks to put in the complex regime to legalize and strictly regulate cannabis in this country, and is the base of Substances Task Force report." Dans son discours à l'ONU en 2016,
in her speech to the UN in 2016, the Minister of Health stated that, and I quote, our drug approach will be global, collaborative, compassionate. Global means exhaustive in this case. You will recall that the working group wrote, "Our recommendations reflect the fact that the current scientific understanding of the weakening of faculties by cannabis has gaps, and that more research on the evidence, investment, tools, and public education are necessary and urgently needed." The president of the working group said that they discovered that the regulation of cannabis affects all aspects of society, and indicated in the other conclusions of the report,
you can hear the podcast.
Science is not definitive on a safe age for cannabis
use. You can hear
use.
someone reading it.
On page 17, there is consensus on the need for pursuing research to understand, validate, and approve cannabis-based medications. On page 6, we know more about the short-term effects of cannabis use. We are less certain about some of its more long-term effects. On page 15.
One of these concerns, then obviously further study will be required. This may explain why Uruguay took 4 years to fully implement their legislation, and distribution is through the network of pharmacies. For whatever reason, the Health Committee did not hear a representative from Uruguay, so I'm curious to learn more about their approach, and in particular what it took them 4 years. If Canada implements Bill C-45 in 8 to 12 weeks, then the only people who will benefit from such an accelerated timeline are big corporations and some unknown stockholder hidden in the tax havens. Revenons maintenant spécifiquement.
Let's get back specifically to Bill C-45. The government is telling us that one of the objectives of this bill is to eradicate organized crime, that is behind the production and sale of cannabis. On which scientific data is the government relying when it legalizes the cannabis use, in thinking that it will attack the activities of organized crime? We don't know. On February 27th, Radio-Canada published a report on cannabis dealers who've been active for a few years. The report highlighted that traffickers are not at all concerned about the future legalization of cannabis. Here's an excerpt from the piece. resellers say that they're ready to start a price war with the state. Government prices will always be higher because there's more bureaucracy, said Vincent, a cannabis reseller in Montérégie. The drop in the value of cannabis on the black market will not threaten the revenues of street resellers. Mélanie, who has been operating for 30 years in Montreal's downtown, said this: "You have 30 grams, you don't go to jail. When I finish that, I will go to my cachet and I will get another 30 grams. I will continue to sell a lot, the same as I've always done." I remind you that in her stash, she has up to 160 grams, and in some provinces, the quantities are even different. That, dear colleagues, can give you a good idea of what we're looking at here. Still concerning organized crime, here is an enlightening comment. Recently, when he appeared before the Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs, Kevin Brosseau, the interim commissioner at the RCMP, questioned the statements made by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and ministers responsible for cannabis legalization within the federal government. They said that it was imperative to legalize the drug to get rid of organized crime from the marijuana black market, which allows them to pocket a fortune. And I quote, "Given the scope of the involvement of organized crime in the illegal cannabis market, we do not expect the bill to eliminate the presence of organized crime in the cannabis market. It will reduce it, but it will not eliminate it." In my opinion, organized crime is constantly evolving, and it always is one step ahead of us. Finally, the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, the SPVM, also shared some doubts about the claims of the Trudeau government, stating that organized crime has already amended its strategies to get around law and order in advance of the legalization of cannabis set for July, the beginning of July. The spokesperson for the SPVM said the following thing: the organized crime is, as its name indicates, organized. It adjusts to market realities. That's what police officers are saying. Along the same lines, it is a bit paradoxical that the Trudeau government claims to want to remove youth from the hands of organized crime. When cannabis is illegal, we see what the habits of our youth look like. According to a technical report by the Canadian Centre to Address Alcoholism and Drug Addiction, published in 2011, estimates for cannabis use in the last year go from 16.7% to 32.4%. According to the Canadian Inquiry on Tobacco, Alcohol and Drugs among students for 2014-2015, youth consumption in 10th and 12th grade is at about 28%. This means, honorable senators, that despite the fact that cannabis is currently illegal, people can procure it easily. This isn't a surprise. But what will happen when Bill C-45 is adopted and it still bans the use of cannabis for youth, among youth? These youth who are consuming marijuana today will continue to do so after legalization. Even more so, because the bill opens the door to growing 4 plants in private homes. How can you imagine that youth won't have direct access to them? In the light of these facts, it is utopic to think that youth won't fall into the hands of the illicit market and that their consumption will decrease.
Age limit purchase cannabis. Of the 620 nations, apart from South Africa, Canada has, according to WHO, the worst drunk driving record. This is hard to believe. Part of the reason is due to the legal age to purchase alcohol. According to Ontario's Ministry of Transportation, the peak age of drinking and driving collision are 19, 20, 21, and that drivers in his age group are almost 1.5 times as likely to be involved in drinking and driving fatal and injury crashes than other other drivers. Now, it is true that some people are already driving stoned, but keep in mind, in Colorado and Washington state, cannabis-related fatalities since legalization become worse every year. Le projet de loi C-45.
Bill C-45 sets the legal age for cannabis use at 18, leaving
there's been a lot of crashes in Colorado because of people stoned.
To date, provinces have set the legal age at 18 or 19. In the United States, all states that legalize cannabis set the legal age at 21. This notion of age is essential. Science indicates that the brain is still growing until the age of 25. Cannabis use before this age is seriously problematic and very dangerous. It is worrisome to read that what the psychiatrists had to say in their briefs presented to the House of Commons during study of Bill C-45, and I quote, "At the clinical level, regular cannabis use among youth translates into attention deficits, memory deficits, processing problems, information processing problems, and intelligence problems. These problems can impact scholastic success. Furthermore, cannabis use increases the risk of developing psychotic issues such as schizophrenia. Psychiatrists, like many specialists, recommend increasing the legal age for cannabis use. Some have spoken about the age of 21, others say it should rather be set at age 25. Basing ourselves on science, it would be irresponsible to not take into account these recommendations. Furthermore, health professionals also alerted us about the THC concentrations in cannabis.
Holy fuck. You talked about
Concentrations
this
as high
already.
as 40, 50, and even 60% have been found. And yet, Bill C-45 does not address this issue at all.
There's no 60% THC weed out there, I know that much.
Bills C-45 and C-46 have major flaws, and their application risks sowing chaos in provincial and municipal administrations. And this is why we always have a good example. We have a good example of growing at home. Bill C-45 sets out an offense if more than 4 plants are cultivated in a home. In Quebec, the National Assembly, in its bill, in Section 9, has formally banned anyone from growing cannabis for home use. The government of Quebec says that there is no question about it allowing home growth. Recently, in an article in the Devoir titled
The translator sounds like she's about to say, fuck this job, I hate this shit, I'm fucking leaving.
Growth, cultivation, Quebec puts Ottawa on guard. Bill C-45 is permissive in the sense that if the provinces wish to equip themselves with more restrictive rules about home growing, they are free to do so, but there are limits to this. I would like the minister to tell us how she can impose limits other than through an act or regulations. What limits is she talking about? Naturally, the government of Quebec responded that it was convinced to act as was its right and that it had legal opinions to support its position. It is quite obvious that everything will be brought before the courts. Nothing to help the citizens with understanding the rules. Yet, during her speech on C-45 in the other place on May 30th, she said this, and I quote, "Generally speaking, the provinces and territories would be responsible for the retail and distribution. They would also be able to impose any other restrictions that they deem appropriate in collaboration with the municipalities, and they could set other rules concerning cannabis cultivation, home cultivation, particularly by lowering the number of plants that residents would be authorized to grow and by restricting the places where they would be allowed to consume cannabis." End of quote. Dear colleagues, the government says that it wishes to protect the health of youth by limiting their access to cannabis. And how is it doing so? It wants to authorize a home cultivation of up to 4 plants without limiting the height of those plants or limiting the THC concentrations. Imagine the following scene. A youth of age 19 decides to grow 4 plants at home. This same youth has 2 brothers, age 17 and 15. Can someone explain to me how, in this example, the Liberal government would restrict the access to cannabis of the youth under the age of 18? Police officers showed me photos of cannabis plants seized during a raid. These plants were as tall as an apple tree, and their production capacity was unimaginable.
So you're gonna have an apple tree sized house.
In short,
dummy.
the possibility of growing cannabis plants at home makes it impossible to control quality, control the THC concentration, the sales price on the market, the accessibility to youth, the traceability of cannabis, and health warnings, the production near school zones and high-risk areas. The logical solution will be to ban home cultivation.
What?
Even veterinarians are worried about animal health.
Oh my
God! The government
God.
isn't concerned about youth accessing them at home. Honorable Senators, I cannot believe that the government, by legalizing cannabis use, is really looking at this as a public health and safety issue. You will see, Honorable Senators, that with this bill, we have before us a huge challenge trying to cover all of the angles that might arise, evaluating all of the issues tied to it, highlighting the many flaws and assessing our options about the possibility of amending it to attenuate the damaging impacts on our society, but above all on youth, and amending it without creating incongruities.
For example, yesterday at the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, when we questioned officials from the Department of Health and from the Department of Justice on the incongruities of the $200 fines that are connected with the height of the plants, that is not set out in the bill, they replied that at the beginning there was a standard for the height in the bill, but that the House of Commons amended the bill to take that out, which they had not foreseen, and therefore the incongruity of the $200 fine. In order to demonstrate that the government has taken into account the impact of the legalization of cannabis on drivers, the government tabled Bill C-46 to deal with this problem at the same time as C-45. But the study of this bill is currently before the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and it has serious flaws. As Senator Brothers emphasized in her speech on C-45 last Tuesday, constitutional, operational, and many other problems. It seems to me that our police forces have to be properly trained and given the tools to adequately or properly face the problems that we're facing under C-45. In this regard, Minister Fournier seemed to be saying the same thing in his letter to the Minister of Justice on February 23rd. He said, in conclusion, we have to reiterate the importance of delaying the coming into effect of the federal legislation until we have proper scientific equipment that is available. We're talking about road safety and the safety of people. Still talking about people driving under the influence of some substances, neither C-45 nor C-46 addresses the problem of drivers of public transport. How could we explain that despite some air and rail accidents that are connected to conductors or drivers who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol over the last few years, that the government has done absolutely nothing in this regard. I remind you that the Transportation Safety Board, in a report on November 2nd, 2017, was recommending changes following an air crash where alcohol was involved. In C46, we introduced a concept of random controls, random testing, or mandatory testing, according to the term used in the bill, not only for the drivers of vehicles involving alcohol. Nowhere is there any mention of random testing for drugs, and even worse, for drivers of public transit. If someone decided to test an airline pilot after the landing and he feels that he is under the influence of some substance, it would be impossible to have random testing done before the pilot gets on board. And this lack of a will to act is just shocking to me. In the United States, such tests for employees in sensitive positions such as airline pilots, locomotive engineers, and heavy truck drivers and people working in the nuclear industries has existed for at least 10 years. And what about the other issues related to the labor market? How can employers know how to act with employees who are consuming during their hours of work, at lunch, in the morning, or at dinner time? This problem exists already. It's not a new one. But the legalization of cannabis will make the use of cannabis common. And in fact, I think the debate around the legislation has already had this effect, in my opinion. I said it at the outset. Personally, I believe that we should vote down this bill, which is not well drafted, and we should do it at second reading and oblige the government to redo its homework to table a new bill that takes into account all of the issues. The experiences that we've seen in the United States could be examined, but we should never forget that Canada is the first and only country in the world who wants to legalize consumption of marijuana for people under the age of 21. And above all, we have to rely on what science has taught us in terms of the ravages caused by drug consumption for the health of our population. And when I talk about that, we'll also have to have a very particular sensitivity to Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples who are particularly affected by the scourge of over-drug consumption.
Current policies have and are causing irrevocable affliction to Indigenous communities. This is one reason why the current government is seeking to adopt and implement the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Part of this declaration is the right to self-determination. For this reason, I want to highlight a few statements by Regional Chief Isidore Day at the Health Committee hearings in September of the last year. He said, First Nations are not prepared to deal with the ramification of Bill 45. In fact, he had, those Canada even know the full impact of cannabis. Chief Day also reminded the committee that American Indian tribes were negatively impacted when Colorado and Washington legalized cannabis. He reiterated that one of the biggest concerns that First Nations have with Bill C-45 is the health and safety of our peoples. He cited statistics that cannabis is the second most abused substance among Indigenous people. In Ontario alone, he added that 33 million is needed to treat First Nation with drugs and alcohol addictions. He concluded by stating, there appears to be more questions than answers. This leads First Nation in a compromised state.
What I'm hearing there is
an accelerated timeline.
They don't believe cannabis is an exit drug.
Yep. Mr. Blair said on September 12th,
they don't think it beneficial for Native
it is
people
important that
to
we
use
focus on getting
cannabis
this job done as quickly as
they
we
have a
are
high
able.
percentage of abuse or something. That's just not fair.
I simply do not see the urgency, especially in light of the chief's day's concerns. Unlike fentanyl that causes on average 4 deaths a day in Canada,
12 deaths a day?
has died
Fuck, there was 6 on my
from
buddy's street
marijuana
like 2
overdose.
weeks ago.
Honorable Senator,
Honorable Senators, I would invite you to vote against this bill at second reading. If, however, this is not the will of senators, I invite the committees that will be studying it and pre-studying it to carefully consider the mitigation measures that we could bring to Bill C-45, including the date of its coming into effect, the legal age for cannabis use, the contributions to tax havens through the commercialization of cannabis, and essential preventions that should precede the legalization of cannabis, random testing for drivers of public transport or high-risk employees, the level of concentration of THC in cannabis, and the limits to the production at home, and as well as significant clarifications in other parts of the bill. Monitoring at the borders, free access in neighboring countries and for friends,
Fuck the news,
the
this is live.
publicity, traceability, the impacts on the labor market, the price offered on the black market, and finally, the realities for Aboriginal people and people who hide behind legal businesses. So many questions and so few answers. And in the wake of all of these questions, I would add a final one.
Someone knocked on the door there and I heard it through the speakers.
Was all this really necessary? In summary, I think that senators will wonder if the legalization of cannabis will really help our nation to move forward, to make us stronger collectively, and ensure that our country continues to evolve for the better. I would have liked the minister tell us that she had studied what countries like Norway have done, who have the lowest consumption rates among youth. I would have liked the government to study the best possibilities rather than the worst. Yeah. I would have liked to see inspiration from the best and not the worst. I would have liked to see the government invest, as in they did in Norway, in cultivation of intellectual and sports pursuits rather than doing this. I can hardly believe that young Canadians will be guinea pigs for the rest of the world. Canada becoming a research lab used by all of the other Western countries. At the beginning of my speech, I spoke about the precautionary principle that government must use. This duty of using the precautionary principle is essential when we're looking at these kinds of realities and we're looking at subjects that we really don't know well. Honorable Senators, to agree with the goal of reducing consumption amongst youth and eliminating organized crime is one thing, but if the only solution the government's proposing doesn't work, and that 5 years down the road the finding is that the government was wrong and that the situation has gotten worse, what will we do? Will we be able to turn the clock back? No. This is a one-way street. It's like a lobster trap, if you will. All of the speeches that we've heard, or almost all of them, have raised significant concerns and many questions regarding the legal use of cannabis. The duty to be careful should be our guide, and with this specific case, C-45, faced with so many uncertainties and unknowns, faced with so many questions without answers, we recommend not passing this bill and to send the government back to do its homework. And please, Mr. Trudeau, be inspired by the best in the world and not the worst. Thank you.
Here starts, he's like, whoo! He's like, oh, whoo! I can hear him in the translation booth.
Ça, c'est la même chose, ok? Je pensais que c'était un autre.
What's he just say?
Call upon Senator Dean to speak next, but I wish to inform colleagues that pursuant to Rule 6-12, when I do that, it will have the effect of closing debate.
Oh shit.
Senator Dean.
Oh shit.
Thank you, Your Honour. I rise today as sponsor of Bill C-45 on right of final reply. I obviously want to comment on what I think has been helpful second reading debate on the bill. I thank senators, all senators, on every side of this place for speaking to this bill, which aims to take a public health and safety approach to cannabis through legalisation, public education and regulation. And given some of the discussion earlier this afternoon, I make these remarks in the spirit of compromise rather than division. Our debates have been important in identifying some key policy issues, some opportunities, and potential challenges associated with the government's efforts to better protect the health of young Canadians and to address Canada's growing illegal cannabis market, which I think we all agree is valued at between $6 and $7 billion annually. We know that cannabis, we agree on this, we know that cannabis is today easily available and frequently used by young Canadians. We know that from data from Statistics Canada, verified by the Library of Parliament, doubly and triply, that 1 in 5 Canadians between ages 15 to 19 consume cannabis, and that number rises to 1 in 3 Canadians between the ages of 20 to 25. Whether that places Canada first, second or third in the world, we should be worried about it. We also know that cannabis use by young people, again from the Library of Parliament, did decline steadily up to 2012 from a couple of decades earlier, and it's risen again since then through to 2015, also verified by the Library of Parliament. And it's clear that early, frequent and heavy use of cannabis and other intoxicants by younger teenagers place them at considerable risk in the years that follow. The use of all intoxicants. And it's strikingly clear that our current approach to regulating cannabis hasn't been successful. It hasn't worked. It has failed. And
until they vote, I'm staying on.
That this is the case. Large numbers of criminal
if it
convictions
fails,
for
I'm
possession
coming back
have made
on.
the situation even worse, and we've heard that in this chamber, and especially for younger Indigenous people.
If I had more weed, I'd be smoking it right now.
That's today, that's last year, that's 5 years ago. That is the present reality. Now, key themes have emerged in the Senate's deliberations so far, and we might have anticipated some of them. Senator Carignan has mentioned them, others have mentioned them. I'm not going to go into the pros and cons. There is information and evidence that informs a number of discourses around these issues. And we're going to have a chance to explore those further in committee, I hope. But I just want to mention the issues without commenting on their validity. The impact on Indigenous communities in terms of risks to health. And we also know from the committee that's on the road, Aboriginal Peoples Committee, as well as economic development opportunities for those Aboriginal communities who are interested in taking advantage of them. We've heard about minimum age of consumption, as well we should. We've heard about the proposed decriminalisation of cannabis possession for young people possessing 5 grams of cannabis or less.
For young people.
I'm just acknowledging these things. We've heard about home cultivation of cannabis. We've heard about the regulatory framework, THC potency, advertising, as raised by
haven't we
Senator
heard about
today, appropriately. We've discussed the disruption of the illegal cannabis market with issues such as the calibration of legal and illegal prices being discussed. There's also been considerable discussion of public education on cannabis. Given Canada's extremely high consumption rates by younger people, we certainly know that just saying no hasn't worked. We've heard from senators in this chamber, including Senator Smith, from Senator Petitclerc, and Senator Stuart Olson, that public education is critical to prevent our youth.
I'm bored. This is fucking, just vote, have it over with. I'm cooking supper out there now.
I couldn't agree more. We've found consensus on something. Let's record that. Budget 2018 proposes to provide a further $62.5 million over 5 years for public education.
I need some marijuana or a girlfriend.
$46 million. This funding will support the involvement of community-based organisations and Indigenous organisations that are educating their communities on the risks associated with cannabis use. A significant digital information campaign was launched on March 16th. Many of us wouldn't have noticed that because, of course, it isn't aimed at us. There will be a TV campaign to follow in the weeks ahead. I was seeing warning signs about drug-impaired driving on overhead gantries, on motorways, on highways in Ontario 18 months ago, before this legislation was introduced in the House of Commons. We have helpful low-risk use guidelines for cannabis developed by the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, and much more will follow in the weeks and months ahead, and indeed we need to see and hear more. And in this area and the related areas of research and treatment, I think many of us appreciate Senator Lankin's advice that we consider in this place the vehicle of observations for conveying our recommendations on the very best approach. And I want to talk some more on mental health, because mental health has been raised here repeatedly, as it should, given the impact of mental health on our communities and on our families in many cases. Colleagues, we've heard in this chamber some very honest, some bruising, some heartfelt concerns about experiences with mental health and addictions. I suspect that there are few of us in this place who have not been touched in our lives by those issues. Few of us that have been spared from the ravages of alcoholism, other addictions and mental health issues in our extended families. I'm no exception to that. I haven't been spared. I don't speak as one of the people untouched. I understand what you're talking about when you talk about mental health issues. We know that early and frequent use of intoxicants, including cannabis by teenagers, can result in mental health issues later in life. We also know that alcohol, cannabis and tobacco are often used in combination. And we know that young people experiencing mental health issues often self-medicate.
Tobacco is for idiots.
And alcohol.
Sorry. I used to smoke, I gave it up. You shouldn't smoke. It's fucking bad for you.
Voice to this earlier today, and we've all learned from it. These are all risk factors that should be of concern to all of us.
Like I shouldn't even be smoking these blunts.
I search my soul and I search the research and I look across Canada to figure out where I can get advice on this. And when I ask these questions, I look to the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health, or CAMH, Canada's premier and world-renowned research and treatment organisation. I've benefited from CAMH programs. I imagine some of you have too. In fact, I know that some of you have too. And everything that CAMH does is based on science, on research and practice, in its clinics, in its labs, on the streets. And this has resulted in important harm reduction products such as CAMH's lower risk cannabis use guidelines that were updated and released in 2017 and are an important contributor to public education and safe use, harm reduction. CAMH has also contributed to cannabis policy debates. They've taken that research and science and converted it into policy advice. Its 2014 cannabis policy framework offered evidence-informed conclusions about cannabis and measures aimed at reducing harms. Copies of this report are being delivered and in fact will be in your offices when you return from the chamber this evening.
What's up, Jim?
Here's what CAMH concluded in this report. Some things that we know already. That cannabis use carries significant health risks, especially for people who use it frequently and or begin to use at an early age. That criminalisation of cannabis heightens these health harms and causes social harms. That a public health approach focused on high-risk users and practices, similar to the approach used with alcohol and tobacco, allows for more control over the risk factors associated with cannabis-related harms.
So risky.
CAMH says that from these conclusions flow another conclusion. It concludes that legalisation, combined with strict health-focused regulation, provides an opportunity to reduce harms associated with cannabis use. However, CAMH tells us that this approach is not without risks. It says that legalisation, it advises us that legalisation without regulation in areas such as setting a minimum age, prohibiting marketing and advertising, and curtailing higher risk products may lead to an increase in cannabis use. Now, Senators, in view of our discussion over the last couple of months, this strikes me as being eminently solid, balanced and sensible advice. Why? Because it touches directly on some of the concerns that have been raised in this chamber, on all sides, Senators, on all sides. And that are part of our consideration in looking at this bill. I've got just 2 or 3 minutes left.
Oh, God.
And I think this balance that CAMH talks about is one of the key aspects. Finding that right balance, getting that balance right, is one of the key aspects of our responsibility as we move forward to apply sober second thought to this bill and as we move into committee review and beyond. Honourable Senators, with 5 Senate committees, I think unprecedented, outside of pre-budget review, with 5 Senate committees slated to take a look at various aspects of Bill C-45. Some of those requested, that committee were requested by people on all sides, argued for by people on all sides of this chamber. I think Canadians should have confidence that we are proceeding diligently and responsibly to conduct in-depth hearings in order to review and, where appropriate, to improve the bill. And colleagues, this is really what tonight's vote is all about, isn't it? Equipping us to do the job that we are empowered to do as senators. Colleagues, allowing beyond our vote tonight, allowing us to hear from experts at all of those committees in ways that equip us to deliver on our constitutional responsibility to bring sober second thought to this bill is absolutely critical. And in doing that, to focus not just on a compendium of problems.
Now he's offering a solution, then he's going to give us
a long list of
final thought.
Problems, challenges, but also to focus on solutions, which is what Canadians expect of us. Honourable colleagues, Canadians expect us to do this, they expect to do this work, and we have a responsibility to meet these expectations. Canadians expect us to confront the issues associated with cannabis, not to sweep them back under the rug for another 20 years, Senators. Not to sweep them back under the rug. Or to pretend that prohibition is working. Honourable Senators, Canadians want us to do our jobs, not to look the other way. Not to look the other way. Let's now move the conversation and learning forward in a transparent and evidence-informed way, in the way that we do best. Let's vote on second reading and referral to committee, and let's empower the Social Affairs Committee to join the other 4 committees in doing its work. Colleagues, I thank all of you sincerely for the opportunity to contribute to this debate as the sponsor of this hugely important piece of legislation. And I look forward to many conversations ahead. And here's my promise to you.
Oh, I really wish I had some cannabis.
Here's my promise to senators on all sides of this house, in every place, regardless of your office or your perspective. As I've done over the last several months, I will do my very, very best in working with you to contribute in a positive way and a deliberate way as we continue our deliberations to make this legislation the best that it can be in responding to known harms of cannabis for young people in this country. Thank you so much.
I respect that. He's telling them to push it forward so they can at least make it right. Don't push it away, make it right. Quit fucking around. That's basically what he said.
Honourable
I can
Senators,
respect
is it
that.
agreed that we not see the clock? Agreed. Are senators ready for the question?
Here we go.
It was moved by the Honourable Senator Dean, seconded by the Honourable Senator Poirier, that this bill be read a second time. Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion? All those in favour of the motion will please say yea. All those opposed, nay. In my opinion, the yeas have it. I see 2 senators rising. Do we have an agreement on a bell? 30-minute bell, table.
6:01.
6:01. Vote will take place at 6:31. Calling the senators.
So there you have it, folks. I'm starved. I gotta have supper, and we're gonna come back as soon as they come back. Give us some shit. Give us a decision or whatever. Cannabis Corner will be right back with them. I'll see you soon.